On the morning of the 22nd of August 1485, on a low hill in the English Midlands, a king did something that kings almost never do. He chose not to run. The battle was not going the way it should have. He had the larger army, the higher ground, the crown itself, and yet his lines were wavering, and the two most powerful men on the field, the brothers Stanley, sat with their thousands and would not commit, watching to see which way to jump. And then, through the smoke and the press, the king saw his enemy, Henry Tudor, an exile with a thin claim and a borrowed army, briefly exposed at the rear of his own lines, almost within reach. So the king gathered his household knights, lowered his lance, and charged. Down the slope and straight across the field he drove into the heart of the enemy, cutting down Henry Tudor's standard-bearer with his own hand, hacking to within a sword's length of the man who had come to take everything from him. For a moment, one moment, he nearly won it all back at a stroke. Then the Stanleys moved at last and moved against him. Their horsemen crashed into his flank. His own horse foundered in the marshy ground, and Richard III, the last Plantagenet, the last king of England ever to die in battle, went down in the mud swinging, crying out a single word: treason. He would not be remembered for that charge. He would be remembered as a hunchbacked monster who smothered his own nephews in their beds, a portrait painted, as it happens, by the men on the winning side of this very field. This is the story of how a loyal man became England's most infamous king. It is darker than the legend admits, and stranger. Because the truth, when you go looking for it, refuses to be either the demon or the saint. He was born into a war, and the war would make him and unmake him, and, long after his death, remake him into something he was not. Richard Plantagenet came into the world on the 2nd of October, 1452, in the great castle of Fotheringhay in Northamptonshire, the youngest of the surviving sons of Richard, Duke of York. To be a son of York in that year was to be born close to the throne and close to the axe, because the Duke, his father, was the most dangerous man in England. Dangerous not because he was a rebel by nature, but because he had a claim to the crown that was arguably better than the crown's own, and a country falling apart around a king who could not rule it. That king was Henry VI, a gentle, pious, broken man, subject to spells of catatonic madness, incapable of governing the fractious lords who circled his throne. Into the vacuum of his weakness poured the ambitions of the great families, and chief among the rivalries was the one between the king's Lancastrian court and the duke's House of York. History would give their long and bloody quarrel a beautiful, misleading name: the Wars of the Roses, the red rose against the white. As though it had been a matter of pageantry. It was not. It was a series of savage, intermittent civil wars fought over 3 decades by armored men who killed one another's fathers and then hunted one another's sons. And it was the element in which the child at Fotheringhay would grow up, the way another child grows up in a language. He was too young at first to understand any of it. He was a small boy, and by all the later evidence not a strong one, the youngest, overshadowed by tall and golden brothers. But he was 8 years old when the war reached into his own family and taught him, in a single winter's day, exactly what kind of world he had been born into. In the last days of December 1460, his father the Duke rode out from Sandal Castle in Yorkshire to give battle to the Lancastrians, and at the Battle of Wakefield he was cut down and killed. With him died Richard's brother Edmund, the Earl of Rutland, a boy of 17, killed, tradition holds, not in the heat of the fighting but afterward, in cold blood, as he tried to flee. It was not enough for the victors to have won. They took the dead duke's head and they set a paper crown upon it in mockery of his royal pretensions, and they impaled it on a spike above Micklegate Bar, the great southern gate of the city of York, so that the head of the man who would be king looked out blindly over the city that bore his family's name. Richard was 8. Somewhere in that winter, the boy and his brother George were bundled across the sea to the Low Countries, to the safety of Burgundy, child refugees of a losing cause, their father's crowned head still rotting on the gate at home. We do not know what he felt. We know only what he saw and what the world was teaching him. That royal blood was spilled as freely as any other, that a defeated man's dignity would be stripped from his very corpse. that mercy on a battlefield in England was a thing that got your children killed. He would carry those lessons all his life. They do not excuse what he would one day do. But no honest account of the man can leave out the schoolroom. And this was the schoolroom. And then, as suddenly as fortune had fallen, it turned. For the House of York was not finished. It had another son, and this one was extraordinary. Edward, the eldest, the new Duke of York, was everything the times demanded and everything young Richard was not. 19 years old, immensely tall, well over 6 feet in an age of smaller men, handsome, charming, physically fearless, and a natural soldier of terrible effectiveness. In the bitter early months of 1461, Edward gathered the Yorkist cause to himself, avenged his father, and marched to a snowbound field in Yorkshire called Towton. What happened at Towton on the 29th of March, 1461, was the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Tens of thousands of men killed one another through a long day of driving snow, and when it was over, the Lancastrian army was destroyed, and the ground, the chroniclers said, was carpeted with the dead for miles. Edward had won a kingdom. Henry VI fled north, Edward rode to London, and there, still not yet 20, he was crowned King Edward IV. For the small boy who had watched his family's ruin, the world inverted overnight. Richard came home from exile not the son of a slaughtered traitor, but the brother of a king, and not merely a brother, but a royal duke. Before he was 10 years old, he was created Duke of Gloucester, a title that carried the weight of the blood royal, and he was drawn into the strange, glittering, perilous orbit of a court that his brother had won with a sword. It is worth pausing on what that meant for the shaping of a mind. Richard of Gloucester never knew a settled world, a lawful and predictable succession, a crown that passed quietly from father to son. He knew only the world Edward had made and the world that had made Edward, a world in which kings were things you fought for, in which a man with an army and nerve could take a throne that the law said was another's, in which his own beloved brother sat on the seat of an anointed king who was still alive and imprisoned. The lesson was not lost on him. He had watched it work. And he had watched, too, what happened to those who lost, the paper crown, the spike, the head above the gate. There was one more thing the boy took from these years, and it was the thing that would define him more than any other, for good and then, catastrophically, for ill. In a family and a country where loyalty was a currency spent and betrayed by nearly everyone, where his own cousin the Kingmaker would soon turn his coat, where his own brother George would turn his twice, Richard fixed upon loyalty as the whole of his character. He chose one man, his brother Edward, and to that man he would be loyal with a completeness that never once wavered through all the years of Edward's life. It would become his motto, written in his own hand in the margins of his books, Loyaulté me lie, loyalty binds me. It is one of the cruel ironies of English history that the man who took loyalty for his motto and kept it faithfully for 30 years would be remembered by posterity for the greatest betrayal of all. But that was still far off, on the far side of his brother's death, in a summer no one could yet imagine. For now there was only a small, watchful, overshadowed boy, learning the trade of lordship in the hard school of the north of England, a boy who had already seen before he was 10 exactly how much a crown was worth and exactly what it cost. The world that Edward IV had conquered was not a settled inheritance, but a thing held down by force, kept in place by the weight of the men who had lifted him onto the throne. Chief among them, and greater than any subject in England had a right to be, was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Half of Europe knew him by a single word. They called him the Kingmaker, and the name was not flattery. Warwick commanded a landed empire that ran across the Midlands and the North, an income that rivaled the Crown's own, and a private following of armed retainers so vast that he could put an army into the field on his own account, and had. He had been the indispensable engine of the Yorkist victory, the money, the men, and the menace that turned Edward's claim into Edward's crown. When the fighting was done and the young king needed his smallest brother schooled in the hard trade of lordship, it was into Warwick's household that the boy was sent, north to a castle called Middleham, in the folded green country of Wensleydale. Richard was in his early teens, perhaps 13, when he came to Middleham around the middle of the 1460s. This was the ordinary making of a nobleman in that century, and there was nothing sinister in it. The sons of the great were placed in the households of the greater to be raised as wards among other boys, to learn from the best master available the whole art of being a lord. It was a rigorous apprenticeship. A boy learned to ride a warhorse and to keep his seat under the shock of a lance, to wear harness until the weight of steel became a second skin, to hawk and to hunt the high moors, to read and to reckon, and to carry himself with courtesy in a hall full of dangerous men. And he learned the thing that no book could teach, how power actually moved through a country, how justice was done and undone, how loyalty was bought and kept, how a great man bound lesser men to himself and answered for them in return. Middleham was the perfect schoolroom for it, because Middleham was not the soft gilded world of the southern court. It was a fortress of grey stone standing among the dales, its business the hard business of the frontier, the management of enormous estates, the settling of the endless quarrels of the northern gentry, and the constant wary watch against the Scots across the border. Here the winters were long and the men were proud, insular, and slow to give their trust, but faithful past reason once it was given. Richard took the imprint of that country and never lost it. The North was not where he was born, but it became, in every way that mattered, his own. Long after Middleham had passed into his hands, long after the men he hunted with as a boy had become the captains of his affinity, the North would be the one part of his life that answered his loyalty with loyalty of its own. That is worth marking now, at the beginning, because it is the single fact about Richard of Gloucester that the legend cannot digest, and it was formed here in Wensleydale before he was a man. He did not learn these things alone. The household was full of other boys of good blood, sent there for the same hard schooling, and it was among them at Middleham that Richard found the friend of his life, Francis Lovell, a fellow ward who would stand at his side through everything that was coming and be with him, still faithful at the very end. The bonds forged in that grey castle were not sentimental things. In a world where allegiances were bought and traded by the season, the few men Richard came to trust, he would go on trusting for the rest of his days, and they would go on trusting him. And two others who shared those halls would run through the whole of his life and mark its ending in ways no child could have foreseen, for it is one of the strange economies of his story that the people who shaped him were so few. The first was Warwick's younger daughter, Anne Neville, a child of that castle some years younger than Richard, growing up in the same halls through the same northern winters. The Earl had no sons. His two daughters, Isabel and Anne, were the heirs to the greatest private fortune in the kingdom, and that fact alone made them the most consequential girls in England, pieces that any ambitious man would give a great deal to move. Nothing romantic need be read into those Middleham years. They were children, but the girl who shared them would, in time and after much blood, become Richard's wife and his queen. The second figure was his own brother. George, Duke of Clarence, stood between Edward and Richard in age, and, it would prove, between loyalty and betrayal in temper. George was handsome and quick and grand, and he was eaten from within by the oldest grievance of the younger son of a great house, that he had been born close enough to the throne to want it and too far to reach it. Where Richard fixed himself early on the one thing he could give without stint, his brother's service, George looked always outward at what he might get and at who might help him get it. In the years to come, the two brothers would make of the same childhood two opposite men. George would turn his coat twice before he was 30. Richard, so far as the record shows, never turned it at all. For this is the thing that was being decided in Richard at Middleham, beneath the horsemanship and the account books, the shape of his character and the choice at the center of it. In a country where loyalty was the most valuable and the most perishable commodity there was, where his own guardian would soon betray the king he had made and his own brother would join the betrayal, Richard settled on loyalty as the whole of himself. He chose one man, Edward, the brother who had come home a giant and won a crown in the snow, and to that man he attached himself with a completeness that never once broke while Edward lived. It became, quite literally, his signature. In the margins of his books, in his own careful hand, Richard wrote 3 words that were his motto and, as near as we can come to it, his creed. Loyaulté me lie. Loyalty binds me. There is no colder irony in English history. The man who took loyalty for his device and kept it faithfully across 30 years, who was loyal in exile and loyal in victory and loyal when loyalty cost him friends, would be remembered by every century after his own as the very figure of treachery, the false uncle, the betrayer of trust, the man who broke every bond. The word he wrote in his prayer books would become the exact accusation flung at his memory. But that reckoning was decades away and unimaginable to the boy in Wensleydale, and it is only honest to say that when Richard wrote those words, he seems to have meant them entirely. The cruelty of his education was that it also taught him how fragile the thing he prized really was. He had a front-row seat to the slow, poisonous souring of the greatest loyalty of the age, for the Kingmaker who housed him was even then turning against the king he had crowned. Warwick had expected gratitude of a particular kind. He had made a young man a king and intended, quite reasonably by his own lights, to rule through him, to guide the marriages, the alliances, the offices, the whole direction of the realm. Edward had other ideas. The king had already done the thing that would break them, marrying in secret and for love a widow of no great house named Elizabeth Woodville, and lifting her wide and hungry family into the places of honor that Warwick believed were his to bestow. The earl who had raised one king to power was discovering that a king once made does not stay grateful, and he was beginning, in his pride, to think that what he had made once he could make again. Richard watched the estrangement widen with the observant, unspeaking attention that was already his habit, and it can only have driven the lesson deeper. He saw the mightiest subject in England prepare to unmake his own creation over a slight to his ambition. He saw the great lords of the land reading the wind and calculating their own advantage. He saw, closest of all and most painfully, his brother George drift toward the Kingmaker's camp, drawn by the promise of a marriage to Isabel Neville and a share of that colossal inheritance, and by the flattering hope that Warwick might do for George what he had done for Edward. All of it confirmed what the paper crown on the gate at York had first taught him. Trust was the rarest thing in the world, and almost no one could be trusted. Richard's answer was not to trust no one. It was to trust one man absolutely, and to be himself the man who could be absolutely trusted. He came out of Middleham somewhere near the age of manhood, hardened by the northern climate, competent in the saddle and the account room and the hall, a serious and watchful young man in the shadow of a brilliant king. He was not the athlete Edward was, nor the charmer. The record gives us instead a figure of discipline and reserve, a man who did his work and kept his word and expected, perhaps too much, that the world would keep faith in return. He had chosen his side and defined himself by his service to it. He had made loyalty not a policy but an identity, and the world he had learned to read was already tilting toward its next convulsion. Warwick's patience was nearly spent. George's discontent was ripening toward treason. The Woodvilles were tightening their hold on the king's ear, and the old nobility was seething. The Kingmaker, who had built the House of York, was about to try to pull it down, and when he did, the country would learn which of the two York brothers had meant his oaths. One of them was about to break faith with the king and follow Warwick into rebellion. The other, still not yet 20, was about to follow his brother into exile, into the cold and the losing side, for no better reason than the 3 words he had written in his book, and to discover what that loyalty was worth when everything else had been stripped away. Every great quarrel has a small beginning, and the quarrel that would tear the House of York in two began in a marriage bed. In the spring of 1464, while the Earl of Warwick was abroad negotiating a grand French match that would crown his own influence, King Edward slipped away and married in secret a young English widow named Elizabeth Woodville, beautiful, Lancastrian by her first marriage, and encumbered with a large and landless family, who now, overnight, became the kin of the king. When the marriage was made public that autumn, the shock ran through the whole nobility, but it landed hardest on the man who had made the king. Warwick had staked his prestige on ruling through Edward and marrying him where policy dictated. Instead, he had been made a fool of, and around him he watched the Queen's relatives gather up the heiresses, the offices, and the honors that the old aristocracy regarded as its own. Here was the first seeding of a poison that would work in the English court for 20 years, the resentment of the Woodville kin-cows, and it began by turning the mightiest subject in the land against the master he had crowned. For a time the wound only festered, but the Kingmaker was not a man to be discarded, and by 1469 he had resolved to take back the government of England by force. He found his instrument in the king's own brother. George, Duke of Clarence, restless and aggrieved, slipped across to Calais, and there, in July of 1469, married Warwick's elder daughter Isabel Neville, in open defiance of the king, sealing the bargain between the overmighty earl and the discontented prince. Within weeks their partisans rose in the north, and at Edgecote Moor near Banbury a royal army was broken. Edward himself was taken and held for a season, a king made prisoner by his own cousin. It was an extraordinary thing, and it did not hold. Warwick discovered that he could seize the king but could not rule in his name. The country would not settle, and grudgingly he had to let Edward go. What followed was worse because it was colder. A fresh rising in Lincolnshire early in 1470 was crushed at a field the men called Losecoat, and in its wreckage the king found proof of Warwick's and Clarence's hands. The two fled, not north this time, but across the sea to France, into the arms of the one power ruthless enough to make use of them. There, brokered by the cunning of King Louis XI, the impossible was arranged. Warwick, who had spent his whole life destroying the House of Lancaster, knelt to Margaret of Anjou, the exiled Lancastrian queen and his oldest enemy, and swore to restore to the throne the broken king he had helped to pull down, Henry VI. The alliance was sealed in blood and marriage. Warwick's younger daughter, Anne Neville, was given to Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian heir. The Kingmaker had changed sides entirely, and in the autumn of 1470 he came back across the Channel at the head of an invasion. This time it was Edward who was caught unready. The rising ran ahead of him. Men he had trusted turned, and in October of 1470, the Golden King, who had won everything at Towton, was forced to run for his life, taking ship from the Norfolk coast with only a few hundred men. Among the handful who went into exile with him was his youngest brother. Richard of Gloucester, not yet 18, chose the losing side and the cold water and the uncertain welcome of a foreign shore, because the king on that ship was Edward, and Richard had already decided what he was. They crossed to the Low Countries as beggared refugees, dependent on the charity of the Duke of Burgundy, while at home Henry VI was lifted blinking out of the Tower and set back upon the throne he barely understood, the strange brief interlude the chroniclers called the Readeption. For the second time in his short life, Richard was an exile of a ruined cause, his father's fate hanging over the family like an inheritance. And for the second time he did not waver. But Edward was a lion in adversity, and adversity did not last. Backed at length by Burgundy, he sailed again in March of 1471 and landed on the Yorkshire coast at Ravenspur, on the same shore where a usurper had once come home to take a crown. He had almost nothing, a few thousand men, a kingdom that had outlawed him, and yet the country began to fall his way as he marched south. Towns opened their gates. Old loyalties stirred. And at Coventry, in a scene that must have cut Richard deeply and gladdened him at once, their brother George abandoned the Kingmaker and came back to Edward, kneeling in the road to be forgiven. The three sons of York were reunited for the reckoning, and Richard rode now not as a watchful boy but as a commander of the king's vanguard, 18 years old and about to be blooded in earnest. They met Warwick outside London, at Barnet, on the 14th of April, 1471, and they met him in a fog. A thick Easter mist lay over the field so dense that the two armies had misjudged their lines in the dark and overlapped, and when the fighting began neither side could see what it was doing. In that blindness the battle turned on an accident. The Earl of Oxford, fighting for Warwick, drove one Yorkist wing from the field and returned through the murk, but his men wore a badge of a star with streaming rays, and in the fog Warwick's own soldiers took it for King Edward's badge of the sun and loosed their arrows into their friends. The cry went up that they were betrayed, and betrayal once cried cannot be unheard. Warwick's army came apart in confusion and dread. The Kingmaker himself, unhorsed and cut off as his line dissolved, was overtaken in the press and killed. Edward had wanted him taken alive. He was cut down instead by common soldiers, and his body was carried to London and shown to the people, so that the whole realm might know that the Maker of Kings was dead. Richard had come through his first great battle. Men of his own household had died within arm's reach of him. There was no pause to bury the dead. On the very day of Barnet, Margaret of Anjou had landed in the west with her son, and the last Lancastrian army was gathering. Edward marched hard to catch her, and on the 4th of May, the two hosts met at Tewkesbury beside the Severn. Here Richard again led the vanguard, and here the war reached its annihilating end. The Lancastrian line was broken and driven in a rout down toward the river, and in that rout Edward of Westminster, the 17-year-old prince in whom the whole hope of the Red Rose was invested, was killed. The contemporary Yorkist account says simply that he was slain in the field as the army fled. Later writers, working for the dynasty that came after, would embroider the death into a murder in cold blood, the boy dragged before the York brothers and struck down. But that is the later ornament, not the earliest record, and the difference between the two is precisely the difference this story keeps insisting upon, between what the sources set down at the time and what men chose to add once it served a purpose. What is not in doubt is the scale of the killing. Beaten Lancastrians who had fled into Tewkesbury Abbey for sanctuary were dragged out days afterward and put to death. As Constable of England, Richard sat in judgment over those summary trials. The Lancastrian cause was not merely defeated at Tewkesbury, it was extinguished. And then within the fortnight came the death that would shadow Richard's name forever. Henry VI, the gentle broken king, had been carried back to the Tower of London after Tewkesbury, and there, on the night of the 21st of May, 1471, he died. The official account, written by the victors, gave out that he had perished of pure displeasure and melancholy, e.t. of a broken heart, on learning that his son and his cause were gone. Almost no one believed it then, and no one need believe it now. Henry was killed because a living Henry, however feeble, was a rallying point, and with his son dead, there was no longer any reason to keep him alive. That much is plain. What is not plain, and this is where the honest account must plant its feet and refuse to be moved, is the hand that did it. In the decades that followed, as the Tudor dynasty made its case against the man it had destroyed, the story hardened into a certainty that Richard of Gloucester himself climbed the stair to the old king's chamber and drove the knife home. It is a vivid image, and it is repeated to this day as though it were fact. It is not fact. There is no contemporary evidence that Richard killed Henry VI. What the record actually supports is narrower and colder. Henry died in the Tower in Richard's brother's power in May of 1471. Richard was in London at the time, and he held the office of Constable of England, which gave him authority over such grim business. From those true things a later age built an accusation that the true things do not prove. Whether Richard gave the order or carried it out or merely knew of it or was simply the highest-ranking man in the vicinity when other men did the work, the sources of the time did not say, because the deed was done in the dark and meant to be. He may have been the instrument. He was certainly, at the least, a servant of the regime that willed it. But the leap from the second thing to the first is a leap the evidence will not bear, and it is a leap that will be made again and again at every dark turn of this man's life. Learn the shape of it here at the beginning, for it is the shape of the whole legend. Richard was 18 years old. In the space of a single spring he had come home from exile, fought 2 battles, seen his teacher and his enemy killed, helped to close the door on an ancient royal line, and stood near the murder of an anointed king. He had done everything his loyalty demanded, and he had done it well, and he had been formed a little further by a world in which the surest way to keep a crown was to make certain no rival lived to want it. He does not yet deserve the legend's verdict, but he was learning its logic. And there was one more thing the war had left in its wake, small amid the wreckage and enormous in what it would become. A girl of 15 named Anne Neville, daughter of the Kingmaker cut down at Barnet, widow of the prince killed at Tewkesbury, now doubly orphaned by the very victory Richard had helped to win, and waiting, though neither of them yet knew it, at the far end of the war for the man who had ended her family's world. To understand the man who would one day be called a monster, you must first go north and stay there a while, because the decade Richard of Gloucester spent as Lord of the North of England is the part of his life the legend cannot afford to look at. It does not fit. A tyrant does not spend 10 years earning the settled love of a proud and difficult country, and Richard did exactly that, and the record of it survives in the driest and most trustworthy of places, in city ledgers and land grants and the minutes of council meetings, in the paperwork of a working government rather than the poetry of his enemies. The North in the 15th century was less a region than a separate realm, cut off from the mercantile hum of London by a wall of high moorland and a temper all its own. It was a frontier watchful against the Scots, governed in practice not by the distant king but by whichever great magnate could command the loyalty of its gentry and hold its peace. For generations that magnate had been a Neville, and it was into the vacancy left by the Neville's destruction that Richard now stepped. In 1472 he married Anne Neville, the Kingmaker's younger daughter, and only a year before, the widow of the Lancastrian prince killed at Tewkesbury. They were 2 survivors of the same catastrophe, each of whom had lost a father to the wars. Whatever the match began as, and it began as politics, the household they built together has the look in its records of something that worked. Through Anne, Richard laid claim to the vast Neville inheritance and the ancient affinity that came with it, the network of retainers and tenants and old obligations that made a man the master of the North. That claim did not come without cost, and the cost is worth naming because it shows the York brothers were already circling one another over property years before they circled over a throne. Anne's elder sister Isabel was married to their brother George of Clarence, and George wanted the whole of the Warwick fortune for himself. When Richard moved to marry Anne and take her half, Clarence resisted furiously. One chronicle records that George went so far as to hide the girl away, disguised, it says, as a kitchen servant, so that Richard could not find her and marry her, and that Richard sought her out and placed her in sanctuary until the matter could be settled. The two brothers quarreled so bitterly over the division of the spoils that the king himself had to intervene and carve the inheritance between them. It was resolved, in the end, in Richard's favor, and to Clarence's lasting resentment, a small, ugly foreshadowing easily missed of how this family divided what it loved. But once the lands were his, Richard did with them something that neither the legend nor the simple logic of ambition can explain. He governed well. Across the 1470s, the wardenship of the marches, the great estates, the lieutenancies against Scotland gathered into his hands until he was, in all but name, the king's viceroy in the north, and he wore that power lightly and used it justly. Men who could never have afforded the long, corrupt journey to the royal courts in London brought their disputes to the Duke of Gloucester instead, and found in his council a hearing that was quick, cheap, and, by the standards of the age, remarkably fair. He arbitrated the endless feuds of the northern families before they could bleed into violence. He took the part of humble petitioners against powerful ones on occasions when a great lord had every incentive to do the opposite. The council he ran to manage all this was the living seed of what, when he was king, he would formalize as the Council of the North, an institution of such practical worth that it outlived him by a century and a half, governing the region long after the dynasty that built it was dust. The city of York knew him best, and York's affection for him is the hardest single fact for the legend to swallow, because it is documented in the city's own hand across years of ordinary business. Its council turned to him again and again to mediate quarrels, to press its interests at court, to right a wrong done to its trade, and it called him in its careful municipal Latin its good and gracious lord, and meant it. These were not flatterers. They were a hard-headed merchant corporation that knew exactly what a governor was worth and gave its regard where it had been earned. What they saw in Richard of Gloucester was not the crookback of the later stage. It was a man who kept his word, held the peace, and answered when they called. The particular causes he took up tell the same story as the general reputation. When the citizens of York found the rivers that carried their trade choked with the illegal fish weirs of powerful men, it was to Gloucester they appealed, and it was Gloucester who took up the fight. An unglamorous, practical grievance of the commons against the great, exactly the sort of thing a self-serving magnate would have left alone. He eased the city's taxes in lean years. He lent it his weight at Westminster whenever it needed a friend near the king's ear. And in return the northern gentry attached themselves to him in numbers, wearing his badge of the white boar, forming an affinity that was among the largest and most loyal any lord in England commanded, a following built not on fear, but on the plain arithmetic of good lordship faithfully kept. It is the single most inconvenient fact in the whole indictment of Richard III, that the men who knew him longest and best, in the one country he actually governed, served him from something close to love. His inner life, so far as a man of that century left any record of it, points the same way. Richard was conventionally and, it seems, sincerely devout. His personal Book of Hours survives to this day, a worn and well-used devotional manual into which was entered, among the prayers, a note of the very date of his birth, an intimate small trace of a man measuring his days against the calendar of his faith. He founded colleges of priests at Middleham and at Barnard Castle to sing for the souls of the dead. He planned at York Minster a chantry on an enormous scale, an endowment for scores of priests to pray in perpetuity. None of this makes him a saint. Foundations of that kind were the ordinary insurance of the wealthy, a hedge against the terrors of the next world. But there is no hint anywhere in it of the theatrical villain of the plays, only the disciplined, orthodox piety of a great man who believed his rank was a duty laid on him by God, and who took the duty seriously. And at the center of it all was Middleham, the grey castle of his boyhood, now the seat of his own settled household. Here Anne kept a small northern court. Here their only son, Edward of Middleham, was born and raised, the golden hope of the line, a boy who would carry the inheritance forward. There was a symmetry in it that Richard cannot have failed to see. He was raising his own heir in the very castle where he had himself been made, teaching the boy the same hard country and the same craft of lordship he had learned in those halls a generation earlier. Around them gathered the great northern families whose sons now filled his household as he had once filled Warwick's, so that the whole affinity renewed itself generation upon generation in the ordinary way of a settled country at peace. For a decade the shape of Richard's life was almost domestic. The round of estate and border and council, the hunting, the hole, the family, the single long stretch of his existence that looks from the outside like contentment. Whatever storms had made him and whatever storm was coming, these were the years in which the man was simply what he had always meant to be, the loyal brother, now grown into the loyal viceroy, governing his corner of the kingdom in his brother's name and asking, by every outward measure, for nothing more than to go on doing it. It is important not to sentimentalize this. The peace of the North was built on the graves of the Neville power that the wars had broken, and Richard's greatness there rested, every stone of it, on a single foundation, the favor of the king in London. He had made himself a kingdom within the kingdom, but he held it as a tenant, not an owner, and the lease ran only so long as Edward lived and Edward willed it. Richard seems scarcely to have thought about that. He was a man who believed that loyalty was a fortress, that a life of faithful service and a record of plain success were armor enough against whatever might come. It was a noble way to see the world, and it was a dangerously incomplete one, for while Richard governed the North and buried himself in its business, the court he had chosen to avoid was hardening against him. The Woodvilles, the Queen's wide and hungry family, had spent these same years entrenching themselves at the center of power, gathering the great offices and, more ominously, the guardianship of the king's heir. To them, the Duke of Gloucester was not the beloved Lord of the North. He was a rival, a great block of independent power standing squarely in the path of their own designs on the future. The truce between the king's brother and the king's wife's family held only because Edward held it, and Edward would not hold anything for very much longer. So the decade that looked like an ending was really only a gathering. Richard had won everything a younger son could reasonably want: a great inheritance, a devoted country, a wife and a son and a purpose, and he had won it by being exactly what his motto said he was. But the whole of it was balanced on the health of one man, and that man, 400 miles to the south, growing fat and tired on the comforts of the crown he had fought so hard to keep, was nearer the end of his life than anyone in the North yet knew. When the news came, it would come suddenly, and it would ask of the loyal Lord of Middleham a question his loyalty had never before had to answer. What a man owes to a brother who is dead and to a boy who is not yet a king, when the people closing in around that boy are the people he trusts least in all the world. For a dozen years after Tewkesbury, England had something it had almost forgotten how to hold: peace. Edward IV, restored and unchallenged, settled into the long second act of his reign, and it was a prosperous one. The lean and dangerous young man who had won a crown in the snow had thickened into a king of appetite and cunning, a lover of fine clothes and rich food and beautiful women, a shrewd manager of money who left the treasury fuller than he found it, and a ruler clever enough to keep his fractious lords too comfortable to rebel. Trade flourished, the merchants grew fat with the king, the court at Westminster became a place of luxury and display. Edward had learned the first lesson of his own violent rise, which was that a settled king is a king no one has reason to replace, and for a decade he made himself very hard to replace. Not every subject admired every choice. In 1475, Edward led the largest English army in living memory across the Channel to make war on France and reclaim the old Plantagenet dream, and then, offered a fortune to go home, he took it. The French king bought him off with a great lump of gold and a yearly pension, and the invasion dissolved into a banquet and a treaty at Picquigny. It was, by any cold reckoning, good business. Edward returned richer than he could have grown by fighting. But it sat ill with the harder men who had crossed the sea expecting a campaign, and the chronicler of the French court noted that among the displeased was the king's own brother of Gloucester, who wanted no part of a peace that was bought rather than won. Richard was a soldier of the old temper, formed by a world in which honor was taken at the point of a lance, and the transaction offended him. It is a small moment, easily passed over, but it shows the grain of the man. Even in loyalty he was not a courtier, and the glittering pragmatism of his brother's court was never quite his own. His own country lay elsewhere, and there he excelled. Richard remained the loyal magnate of the north, the king's shield on the Scottish frontier, and in 1482 he was given the chance to prove it in the field. Edward, meddling in a Scottish succession quarrel, sent his brother north at the head of a great army. Richard drove into Scotland, entered Edinburgh itself, and, most lasting of all, retook the border fortress of Berwick-upon-Tweed, which the Lancastrians had handed to the Scots 20 years before as the price of their help. Berwick came back to England that August, and it has never left. It was a real and solid achievement, the kind of hard border work Richard understood, and it crowned his reputation. He was, in the eyes of the realm and of his brother, the most trustworthy man of the blood royal, the competent viceroy, the victorious general, the loyal brother who wanted the north and asked for nothing at the center. But the center was rotting quietly in a way that had nothing to do with Scotland. The sickness in the House of York was its own kin, or rather, the Queen's kin, and the hatred they drew. When Edward had married Elizabeth Woodville for love, he had married a whole family into the heart of the monarchy, and that family had spent the years since gathering everything within reach. The Queen's brothers and her sons by her first marriage and her many sisters had been fitted out with the richest heiresses, the highest titles, the most lucrative offices. They had become, in a single generation, a new nobility grown not from ancient blood or service in the wars, but from proximity to the king's bed. To the old aristocracy this was an outrage, a swarming of upstarts into places they had not earned, and Richard, watching from the north, came to regard the Woodvilles with a settled distrust that would in time become the axis on which his whole fate turned. The engrossing was not an abstraction. It could be counted in marriages, and the count was breathtaking. The Queen's brother, John Woodville, barely 20, had been wedded to the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, a woman near 70, a match the chroniclers called a scandal and a diabolical bargain, made for nothing but her lands. Her son, the Marquis of Dorset, carried off one of the greatest heiresses of the age, and a boy of the highest royal blood, Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, was married as a child to the Queen's sister, Catherine, a Woodville match he is said to have resented all his life, and would remember when his own moment came. One by one, the richest wards and widows and heiresses in England were gathered to the Queen's kin, until the old nobility looked up to find the entire marriage market of the realm cornered by a single family. It was lawful, it was, in its way, ordinary, but it was total, and it bred a hatred that would outlive the king who allowed it. It would be a distortion, even so, to paint them only as villains, and this account will not. Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, the Queen's eldest brother, was among the most cultivated men in England, a jouster of European fame, a pilgrim, a translator of devotional books, the patron whose encouragement helped William Caxton print the first book in the English language. There was real refinement in the family, and real ability. But refinement was not the point. The point was power, and the most dangerous power they held was the one that mattered above all others. They controlled the future king. Edward's heir, the young Prince of Wales, was not being raised among his father's brothers or the seasoned men who had won the throne. He was being brought up far off at Ludlow, on the Welsh border, in a household run by his mother's family, governed by his uncle Earl Rivers, attended by his half-brother Sir Richard Grey, shaped day by day into a king who would know the Woodvilles as his own people and the Duke of Gloucester as a stranger. For Richard this was a slow, gnawing alarm. He could see the shape of what was coming. A boy-king wholly formed by the faction he trusted least, a Woodville-run minority in which men like himself would be pushed to the margins or destroyed outright. The enmity ran both ways, and both sides knew it. The Woodvilles saw in Gloucester a great independent lord who would never bend to them. Gloucester saw in the Woodvilles a grasping interest that meant, when the old king died, to seize the young one and rule through him. It was not merely a matter of wounded pride on either side. It was a cold contest for control of the succession, being fought in advance in the guardianship of a child, and the king who might have held the balance between them was drifting, fat and ailing, and perhaps unwilling to see, toward an early grave. The family had, besides, already shown what it was capable of doing to its own. The proof had come in 1478 in the death of the middle brother, and it was the ugliest thing the House of York had yet done to itself. George, Duke of Clarence, had never stopped being what he was, vain, unstable, and treacherous. But after his wife Isabel died at the end of 1476, he came apart entirely. Convinced on no evidence that she had been poisoned, he seized one of her former servants, a woman named Ancaret Twiniho, dragged her before a court he had bullied into obedience, and had her hanged, a private murder dressed as justice, in open contempt of the king's own law. He meddled in treasonable talk, he let his associates be condemned for plotting the king's death by sorcery, and then stormed into the council to denounce the verdict. It was a direct challenge to the crown, and Edward, provoked past the last of his patience with a brother he had already forgiven once, chose at last to end him. In January of 1478, the king himself stood forth in Parliament to prosecute his own brother. The sentence of attainder passed, and a few weeks later, in private within the Tower of London, Clarence was put to death. The manner of it became one of the most famous rumors in English history, that a prince of the blood was drowned in a great butt of Malmsey wine, and true or not, its very grotesqueness fixed the horror of the thing. The House of York had begun, in earnest, to devour its own. Richard's place in that death is genuinely uncertain, and honesty requires that it be left uncertain. It was later reported that he took his brother's execution hard, that he grieved it openly, and blamed the Queen's family for driving Edward to it. And that report, if true, fits the man. But it was written down years afterward, colored by hindsight, and it sits against a harder fact, that Richard profited. In the redistribution that followed Clarence's fall, offices and lands and advantages came to Gloucester, and he did not refuse them. The Tudor writers would later go much further and claim that Richard had secretly engineered the whole ruin, working his brother's destruction to clear his own path toward a crown he did not yet have any reason to expect. There is no proof of that whatsoever. It is the legend reading backward again, fitting a later villain to an earlier grave. What can be said, and only this, is that Richard stood near another dark death, said the right things, and quietly gathered the profit. The same ambiguous posture that will recur larger and more terrible 5 years on. So the golden years drew toward their close, with the gold already tarnishing beneath the surface. The king was prematurely old, his great frame ruined by his own excess. The Woodvilles held the air and waited. The old nobility seethed. And in the north, the one man of the blood royal, with the power and the standing to check the Queen's family, kept his watch, loyal as ever, trusting still that a lifetime of faithful service would be shield enough for whatever came. Then, in the first days of April 1483, the messengers began to gallop north out of Westminster, with news that would end the peace and everything that had rested on it. The Golden Brother, the anchor of Richard's entire world, the one man to whom his whole life had been pledged, was dying, and the moment he was gone, there would be nothing left standing between the Duke of Gloucester and the family he feared, except a 12-year-old boy, a contested will, and a race to London that both sides already understood they could not afford to lose. On the 9th of April, 1483, Edward IV died at Westminster, a few weeks short of his 41st birthday. The illness had been short, a fever taken after some indulgence, the physicians helpless, the great body that had carried him through Towton and Tewkesbury failing all at once, but its consequences were not short at all. Edward had been the keystone of England for more than a decade. He had held the ambitious lords in balance by the sheer force of his presence, and the peace of the realm was, in truth, nothing more solid than the fact of him. When he died, the arch he had been holding up did not fall at once. It simply began, very quietly, to move. For the whole settlement of the kingdom now rested on a boy. Edward's heir, the new King Edward V, was 12 years old and 200 miles away at Ludlow, on the Welsh border, in a household run from top to bottom by his mother's family. A minority was the most dangerous thing that could happen to a medieval kingdom. A crowned child was a prize to be captured, and whoever held the child held the state, and everyone who mattered understood from the first hour that the death of the old king had opened a contest for the person of the new one. Edward had understood it too. On his deathbed, knowing his son was young and the court was divided, he had named his brother Richard of Gloucester as Lord Protector to govern the realm until the boy came of age. It was the obvious choice. Richard was the last adult male of the House of York, a proven ruler and the one great magnate untainted by the factions of the South. but a dying king's wish is only words, and words would have to contend with the people who already held the boy. England had walked this road before, and the memory of it was not reassuring. 60 years earlier, another boy had come to the throne, Henry VI, king at the age of 9 months, and the long minority that followed had been a running quarrel among the lords who governed in his name, a quarrel that helped, in the end, to breed the very wars that had devoured Richard's own family. The office of protector was itself a fragile, half-defined thing. It made a man the first among the council, but not a regent. It charged him with the defense of the realm, but gave him no free disposal of it. And it was understood by everyone to be temporary, dissolving the instant the boy was crowned or came of age. It concentrated enormous responsibility and guaranteed almost no lasting power. A protector stood in effect upon a trapdoor, and the lever that would spring it was the coronation, which is exactly why the date of that coronation was about to become the most important question in England. Those people were the Woodvilles, and they moved fast because they had the most to lose. The Queen's family had grown great entirely in the sunshine of Edward's favor, and with Edward gone, that sunshine was gone. Their only security lay in keeping their grip on the young king they had raised, so in the council at Westminster they pressed hard for 2 things. They wanted the boy crowned quickly, because a crowned king, even a child, rules through a council of his choosing, and a coronation would quietly dissolve any protectorate before it began. And they wanted him brought up to London under a large armed escort, a small Woodville army, so that whoever met him on the road would meet him on the family's terms. Set a date early in May, crown the boy, govern in his name, and the Duke of Gloucester, far away in the north, could be thanked for his loyalty and left with nothing. That was the plan, and it was a good one. It very nearly held, but the old king's oldest friend broke it. William, Lord Hastings, had been Edward's Lord Chamberlain and his closest companion in war and in pleasure for 20 years, and he hated the Woodvilles with a personal, well-aged hatred, a rivalry of long standing with the Queen's son, the Marquis of Dorset, over offices, over influence, over the affections of the same women. Hastings had no intention of living under a Woodville regency. He knew that if they crowned the boy on their own terms, men of the old king's circle like himself would be swept from power within the month, or worse. So he fought them in the council, forcing the promised escort down to a smaller number, and then he did the decisive thing. He sent urgent secret word north to Richard. Come, and come quickly, and come strong enough to take the young king into your own keeping before the Woodvilles crown him, for if you wait, there will be nothing left to protect. The warning reached Richard in the north, and how he received it is the very heart of the puzzle of the man, because from this point onward, his every act can be read 2 entirely opposite ways, and the sources themselves cannot agree. What is not in dispute is that his first moves were correct, careful, and loyal in every outward form. He did not rush wildly for London. He wrote letters of dutiful condolence to the widowed queen and letters of loyalty to the council, insisting on his devotion to his brother's memory and to his brother's son. He went to the city of York, and there, in the minster, held a solemn requiem for the dead king, and, most pointedly, he gathered the lords and gentry of the north, and had them swear a public oath of fealty to the new sovereign, Edward V. Only then did he ride south in mourning black, with a retinue that was substantial but not an army, sending word ahead that he wished to meet his nephew's party on the road and escort the young king into his capital himself, as a loyal uncle and protector should. And here the 2 readings of Richard of Gloucester part company and never meet again. In one, he is exactly what he appears, a grief-stricken, dutiful brother, executor of a sacred trust, moving with proper caution to keep the realm from falling into the hands of a grasping faction that meant to hijack a child and rule through him, a patriot doing a hard job by the book. In the other, every gesture of loyalty is a mask, the requiem and the oath and the black mourning all part of a deliberate approach. The calm walk of a man who has already decided to seize the crown and is merely being careful about how he reaches for it. The honest difficulty, and this film will not pretend it away, is that both readings fit the evidence because the outward acts are identical either way. A man defending the Constitution and a man beginning a coup would, at this exact moment, do precisely the same things. Nothing Richard had yet done proved which one he was. It is entirely possible he did not yet know himself. What tilted the ground beneath him was that the Woodvilles were not waiting to find out. Even as Richard rode south, they were bringing the young king up from Ludlow toward London under arms, on a route and a timetable of their own choosing, plainly intending to reach the capital, crown the boy, and present the Protector with a settled situation he could only accept. To Richard and to Hastings, feeding him news from within the council, this looked like exactly what they had feared: a faction rushing to steal a march, to make the Protectorate a dead letter and put the king beyond his reach. If Richard let them arrive first, he would be protector in name and nothing in fact, a great lord invited to a coronation that had already disposed of him, and a man who had spent his whole life on the losing end of other men's swiftness knew precisely what happened to those who moved too late. Nor was it only the escort on the Western Road. In London, the Queen's kin were moving to grasp the sinews of power before the Protector could arrive to claim them. Her son, the Marquess of Dorset, held the Tower of London, and with it a share of the dead king's treasure. Her brother, Sir Edward Woodville, was handed command of the royal fleet and put out to sea, ships and money together. To Richard, taking in the news as he rode, it can only have hardened the darker reading, a family not merely hurrying a coronation, but gathering the armory, the money, and the ships into its own hands. Whether they armed to seize the state or to defend against a seizure they feared from him, no one outside their councils could say, and perhaps they themselves could not. But the effect was the same. It had the look of the opening of a war, and it made Richard's own hardest options begin to seem, in his own eyes, less like ambition than like survival. It is worth pausing on the child in the middle of all this calculation, because he is so easily lost inside it. Edward V was 12 years old, and by the accounts that survive, he was a promising boy, grave beyond his years, carefully schooled, fond of books, raised by his uncle Rivers into exactly the kind of cultivated prince his pleasure-loving father had never troubled to be. He had spent nearly the whole of his short life at Ludlow, hundreds of miles from the uncle who was now riding hard to take charge of him. To Edward, the Duke of Gloucester was very nearly a stranger, a name out of the far north attached to a dead father's trust, while the men he knew and trusted were the Woodville kinsmen at his side. Whatever was about to be done in his name and over his head would be done to a frightened child who had just lost his father and who could not have grasped a tenth of the forces now converging on the road ahead of him. So the two parties came on toward each other through the last days of April, the boy king's household riding down from the west under his Woodville uncle Earl Rivers, and the Protector riding down from the north, gathering to himself along the way a powerful ally in Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, a man of the highest blood and his own deep grudge against the Queen's family. Their roads would cross near Northampton, in the flat middle of England, at the very end of the month. Everything that Richard had been, the loyal brother, the just governor, the man whose one unbroken virtue was faith, was riding toward a single meeting on a country road, where for the first time in his life, loyalty to his dead brother, and loyalty to his brother's living son, and his own naked need to survive would all point in different directions, and he would have to choose. The kingdom held its breath. The old king was 3 weeks in his grave, the new one was not yet crowned, and the question of who would truly rule England was about to be decided not in a council chamber or a cathedral, but by whichever man reached the boy first. The king was dead, and the world had tilted on its axis. Edward IV, who had taken his crown with a sword and held it for 22 years, died on the 9th of April, 1483, worn out at 40 by a life of appetite and ease, and the stability he had imposed on England died with him. He left an heir who was 12 years old, a boy named Edward who had spent almost his whole life far from his father's court, at Ludlow on the Welsh marches, in the household and under the influence of his mother's family. He left, too, a decision that during his son's minority the realm should be governed by his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the loyal one, the man of the north, as Lord Protector. When the news reached Richard in Yorkshire, he did not merely mourn, he moved. He was protector by his brother's dying wish and by his own lifelong creed of service to Edward's line. But he understood at once that a title on parchment was worth exactly as much as the men who would enforce it, and the men around the young king were not his. They were the Woodvilles, the kin of the Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, a family that had climbed from modest gentry to the summit of the kingdom on the strength of a royal marriage, and that had been resented and feared by the older nobility for 20 years. They held the boy. They held the treasury and the fleet. and in the first days after Edward's death they moved by every account to have the child crowned quickly and the protectorate quietly set aside, so that power would rest not with the paternal uncle, but with the Queen and her brother, Earl Rivers. Richard had been warned. From London, William, Lord Hastings, Edward IV's oldest friend, and the Woodvilles' bitterest enemy at court, sent word urging him to come south fast and in strength before the Queen's party could present the country with a crowned king and a dissolved protectorate. Richard rode south. On the way he was joined at Northampton by Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, a great magnate of the blood royal, with his own long grievance against the Woodvilles and his own vaulting ambition, who would become the most important and the most dangerous of Richard's allies in the weeks to come. What happened next was not a battle but a seizure, executed with cold precision. The young king's escort, some 2,000 strong under Earl Rivers, had gone ahead to Stony Stratford. Rivers himself rode back to Northampton to greet the protector and was received with warmth. The two dukes and the earl dined together in apparent good fellowship. In the morning the fellowship was gone. On the 30th of April, Richard and Buckingham rode to Stony Stratford, arrested Rivers, and took the boy king into their own keeping. With Rivers they seized Richard Grey, the king's half-brother, Sir Thomas Vaughan, his aged chamberlain, and Sir Richard Hote. Richard knelt to his nephew with every outward mark of reverence, and then, over the boy's protests, dismissed his servants and sent the prisoners north, to Sheriff Hutton, to Middleham, to Pontefract, the castles of his own country, where no Woodville writ ran. In a single morning the new king had been stripped of his mother's family and surrounded by his uncle's men. Here the sources divide, and honesty requires that both readings be held at once. In one, Richard is a man acting in genuine self-defense and in defense of the realm. The Woodvilles had indeed moved to exclude him, had indeed raised an armed escort, and a protector who let himself be disarmed and outmaneuvered by the faction that controlled the boy king might expect, on the evidence of the age, to end as Rivers' prisoner rather than the reverse. In the other, the Woodville threat is the pretext and not the cause, and every step from Northampton onward is the opening move of a campaign whose object was already the crown. The difficulty, then and now, is that the same actions serve both stories. A man defending himself and a man beginning a usurpation would, in the last days of April 1483, have done very nearly the same things. The record does not let us see into his intent, and we should be wary of any account that claims it does. When the news reached London, it did not produce calm, it produced terror. On the night of the 30th of April, Queen Elizabeth gathered her younger son, Richard of Shrewsbury, and her daughters, and fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. Sanctuary was the most ancient and inviolable protection the Church could offer, a shield no layman could lawfully breach, but to flee into it was also a public confession of fear and of defeat. The sight of the Queen, who had reigned in splendor, now huddled with her children in the Abbey precinct while the Protector escorted the boy king toward the capital, told every watching citizen and every foreign ambassador the same thing: the settled peace of Edward's reign was over. Richard entered London on the 4th of May, riding behind his nephew in mourning black, the boy dressed in blue velvet and displayed to the people as their king. He brought with him cartloads of weapons stamped with Woodville badges, which he exhibited as proof of a plot against his life, a piece of political theatre whose truth no one could then or can now wholly test. The boy was first lodged in the bishop's palace beside St. Paul's, and then, by the middle of May, as the council settled the arrangements for the crowning, he was moved to the royal apartments of the Tower of London. It is essential to understand what the Tower was in 1483, because 5 centuries have taught us to hear the name as a sentence. In Richard's time, the Tower was not yet a byword for the scaffold. It was a working royal fortress and a palace, a residence of comfort and state where kings by ancient custom lodged in the days before their coronation, and from which the coronation procession traditionally set out through the city to Westminster. To lodge the young king in the Tower was at first the ordinary and expected thing. It signaled a coronation, not a prison, and so the business went forward. A date was fixed for the crowning, the 22nd of June. Robes were ordered, lodgings assigned, summonses sent. The machinery of a normal accession turned with a grim, deliberate steadiness, and for a few weeks it was possible to believe that England would have its boy king after all. In the boy's name, meanwhile, the ordinary business of the realm went on. Writs sealed, offices granted, letters dated by the regnal year of a king styled Edward V, a reign recorded on parchment and in the turning of the Great Seal, and destined to end without a crowning, without a portrait, and without a grave of its own. Yet through May the strain told in 100 small ways. The council did not speak with one voice. Some lords pressed to have the boy crowned on the day appointed, and the protectorate ended, as was normal once a king was crowned. Others, wary of the Woodvilles and grateful to the man who had broken them, were content to let Richard's authority run. Two futures were being prepared at once, a coronation and a consolidation, and only one of them could happen. Richard knew the ground beneath him was unstable because he had made it so. He had achieved his office by force, by arresting the king's own kinsmen without trial and holding them in his northern fortresses. He could not undo it. He could not release Rivers and Grey and restore them to the boy's side without handing his enemies both power and a grievance. Nor could he stand still, for his authority was tethered to a child who would one day come of age, remember who had seized his uncles, and be counseled by a family that would never forgive. Every calculation of his own safety pointed the same way, toward a narrowing road. He did not have his brother's gift for winning men. Edward had ruled by charm as much as by fear. He had been magnificent, approachable, easy. Richard was none of these things. He was pious, hard-working and reserved, a man who commanded rather than seduced, and he moved through London ringed by a guard of northern soldiers, men loyal to him personally and strangers to the capital, whose accents and armed presence the Londoners mocked and mistrusted. The city watched him with a wary, silent attention. These were people who remembered the Wars of the Roses within living memory, and they knew, as everyone knew, that when a protectorate began to look like a purge, it rarely ended in a peaceful reign. At his shoulder through all of it was Buckingham, raised now to enormous power, granted authority across Wales and the Marches, rewarded beyond any other subject in the realm, and by every indication urging the protector on, past the limits of the office he held. What passed between the two men in private cannot be known. What can be seen is the trajectory. With each step Richard took to secure himself, he closed off the step behind him, until the guardian of the king had become, by the plain logic of events, the antagonist of the king's whole house. He spent his days in council and his nights in the correspondence of power, and some part of his hours in the company of a nephew who still, presumably, looked to him as a protector should be looked to. What passed between uncle and boy in the apartments of the Tower is beyond recovery. The records are silent, and the silence is its own kind of evidence. He had taken custody to ensure stability and had produced its opposite. He had broken the Woodville grip to protect the king and had isolated the throne. He stood at the center of the kingdom, the most powerful man in it, with a boy in his keeping and a growing company of enemies waiting for him to overreach. He had not yet claimed the crown, he had not yet harmed the children. But the distance between the protector of the realm and the ruler of it was closing, and Richard of Gloucester, the man whose whole life had been built on the single word of his motto, that loyalty binds him, was walking toward a council chamber in the Tower, and a morning in the middle of June when the mask of the protector would come off and the country would see what lay beneath it. 11 weeks. That was the whole span of it. From the death of Edward IV in April to the crowning of Richard III in July, and at its center was a single morning that turned a protectorate into a usurpation and a loyal man into something harder to name. By the second week of June, 1483, the pretense of an ordinary regency was wearing through. Richard had begun quietly to prepare for a longer and stronger hold on power than a protector until a coronation could claim. Letters went north asking for armed men to march on London, and the council, which had been governing in the young king's name, had begun to divide between those who would see Edward V crowned on the 22nd of June as arranged, and those moving with the protector towards some other end. On the morning of the 13th of June, Richard summoned a portion of the council to the Tower of London. Among them was William, Lord Hastings, Lord Chamberlain, Edward IV's closest companion, and the very man who, in April, had sent Richard the warning that brought him south and made him protector. Hastings had backed Richard against the Woodvilles because he believed the two of them wanted the same thing: the boy crowned, the Queen's family checked, the old order preserved. He had not grasped that the road Richard was now on ran past the boy and past him. He would grasp it only at the end. What happened in that chamber comes to us mostly through later, hostile pens, and its theater should be treated with caution. But the hard fact at the center is not in doubt. Richard accused Hastings of conspiring against him, of plotting his destruction, and there was no trial, no hearing, no interval for defense. Hastings was taken out of the chamber and beheaded that same day, given barely time to make his confession to a priest. The Lord Chamberlain of England, a peer of the realm and lately the Protector's own ally, was dead within the hour of being accused on nothing more than the Protector's word. This is the hinge of the whole story, and it must be given its full weight. Everything Richard had done to this point could be read, was read by many at the time, as the rough but defensible maneuvering of a great lord protecting himself and the realm against a grasping faction. The seizure at Stony Stratford had shed no blood, but the killing of Hastings was different in kind, not merely in degree. It was the arbitrary, judicial murder of a loyal man, without process of any sort, and whatever Richard's motives had been in April, here he crossed into another country. From this morning forward he ruled by the plain threat of the same treatment to anyone else. At the same meeting other men were seized: John Morton, Bishop of Ely, Thomas Rotherham, Archbishop of York, and Lord Stanley, whose forces would one day decide the field at Bosworth, though these kept their heads. Even in an age schooled in violence, this was felt as a breach. Men expected a great lord to fall, but by attainder, by trial, by some form at least, not to be hauled from a council table and killed on an hour's accusation. That a peer of England could be destroyed on nothing but the word of the man in power was the lesson of the 13th of June, and everyone who heard of it understood the terms on which they now lived. The message to the rest was not lost, the council was cowed. The opposition, such as it was, had been decapitated in a single stroke. With Hastings dead, one obstacle remained to a clean seizure of the royal family. The younger prince, 9-year-old Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, was still in sanctuary at Westminster with his mother. A protector who meant to rule could not leave the king's only brother in the keeping of the Woodvilles, a living rallying point beyond his reach. And so, on the 16th of June, pressure was brought to bear on the sanctuary. Thomas Bourchier, the aged Archbishop of Canterbury, apparently in good faith, persuaded that the boy was wanted only to attend his brother's coronation and that no harm was intended, went into the abbey to induce the Queen to give him up. Whether she believed it or was simply faced with soldiers ringing the precinct and no way to refuse, Elizabeth Woodville surrendered her second son. He was taken to the Tower to join the king, for company and for safety, or so it was said. The gate closed behind him. The two sons of Edward IV were now together, and both in the hands of the man who was about to unmake them. It was a small, quiet violence done to the oldest protection the age recognized, a mother persuaded or compelled to hand a child out of sanctuary on a promise of safety. Within weeks that promise would look like the cruelest kind of lie. What followed was the case for the crown, the intellectual architecture raised to justify what force had already accomplished. On the 22nd of June at Paul's Cross, the open-air pulpit that was the loudest voice in London, a cleric named Ralph Shaw preached on a text from the Book of Wisdom: "That bastard slips shall not take deep root." The sermon carried a claim that struck at the root of Edward IV's whole line. It was said, and a bishop, Robert Stillington of Bath and Wells, was later named as the man who could vouch for it, that before Edward married Elizabeth Woodville, he had already been contracted in marriage to another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler, a daughter of the old Earl of Shrewsbury. By the law of the Church, a binding pre-contract was as good as a marriage, and if Edward had been pledged to Eleanor while she yet lived, then his union with Elizabeth was no marriage at all, and every child of it, Edward V, Richard of York, and all their sisters, was illegitimate and barred from the throne. Whether this was truth or a convenient fiction is one of the great unanswerable questions of the century, and it deserves to be weighed honestly rather than waved away. Eleanor Butler was real and dead by 1483 and could contradict no one. Edward IV had certainly been reckless in his private promises where women were concerned. A secret pre-contract was not, in his case, implausible, and his own scandalous secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had set the pattern. It is possible the story had substance. It is equally possible it was assembled to order, produced at exactly the moment it was needed, and never tested in the one forum that might have found it false, for it was never submitted to a church court, whose business such a question properly was. What is certain is the effect. True or false, the pre-contract disinherited 2 children and transferred their crown to their uncle, and it was accepted not because it had been proved, but because the man it favored commanded the tower, the treasury, and the swords in the street. The rest moved quickly. On the 25th of June, in the north, the prisoners taken at Stony Stratford, Earl Rivers, Richard Grey, and Sir Thomas Vaughan, were beheaded at Pontefract, again without trial, the second stroke of judicial killing in the coup, clearing away the men with the best cause and standing to resist it. That same day, an assembly of Lords and Commons, gathered in London for the Parliament that would now never sit, was presented with a petition setting out Richard's title and begging him to take the crown. On the 26th of June, 1483, Richard of Gloucester accepted. He went to Westminster Hall, seated himself in the marble chair of the King's Bench, and dated his reign from that day. The claim was afterward enacted by his one Parliament, in January 1484, as a statute called Titulus Regius, the title of the king, which set down the illegitimacy of his nephews as the law of the land. On the 6th of July, the crown was made real in the old way, with holy oil and ancient ceremony. Richard and his queen, Anne Neville, were crowned together in Westminster Abbey in a coronation of deliberate magnificence, attended by almost the whole peerage of England, a great show of unity and legitimacy staged over the fault lines of how it had been won. The Duke of Buckingham, who had done more than any man to raise Richard up, walked in the first rank of the ceremony, bearing high office, the partnership at its zenith only months before it turned to open war. It was among the most fully attended coronations of the century, and within 2 years a great number of the lords who knelt to Richard that day would have abandoned him, or taken the field against him, or died in his cause. In the space of a single season, the loyal brother of the old king had become the crown supplanter of the new one, and had done it outwardly with the consent of the realm. Yet even the grandest ceremony could not fill the silence that was already forming at the center of things. The city was quiet, not rebellious, but watchful, with a wariness that felt almost spectral. The northern soldiers who had come south at Richard's summons filled the streets around the coronation, a reminder to anyone who needed one of what the show of consent rested on. And in the tower, the 2 boys who had been the visible reason for everything, the king to be protected, the brother to keep him company, were seen less and less. In the early summer, they had been glimpsed shooting and playing within the walls, then only at the windows, and then as the weeks drew on, not at all. Richard had the crown he had taken. He did not, and never would, produce the children whose place he had taken to get it. The crown that Richard had spent his life believing was the reward of loyalty now sat on his head as an isolating weight. He had reached the summit, and he had reached it by cutting the very cords of family and tradition that had defined him. The boy who had learned at the gates of York that royal blood was cheap had grown into the man who proved it. The reign had begun, and in the quiet of the royal apartments, out of sight, the true cost of it was gathering, the question that would outlast Richard by 500 years, and turn his name, in the end, from a king's into a byword. The summer of 1483 began with a coronation that never happened and ended in a silence that has never been broken. In April, the 12-year-old Edward V had been a king in waiting, riding toward his capital and his crown under the protection of his uncle. By the end of June, that uncle wore the crown himself, and Edward, with his 9-year-old brother Richard of Shrewsbury, had been lodged in the Tower of London. It bears repeating that this was not, in itself, an act of murder or even yet of obvious menace. The Tower was a royal residence, and the securest set of walls in the kingdom was a natural place to keep 2 boys whose very existence had just been declared a problem. But over the weeks of that long, close summer, the meaning of their residence changed, slowly and then completely. At first they were seen. Londoners and visitors to the Tower reported the 2 boys at their sport within the walls, shooting at the butts, glimpsed in the garden and at the windows of the royal lodgings. They were the living proof of the new king's account of himself, that his nephews were safe, provided for, merely set aside from a throne that had never lawfully been theirs. But the sightings thinned as the summer wore on. The boys were drawn back from the outer apartments toward the inner ones. They appeared at the windows less often, and then they withdrew, or were withdrawn, from the sight of the world altogether. Almost everything we can honestly say about their disappearance rests on two near contemporary witnesses, and both must be handled with care because neither claims to know what we most want to know. The first is Dominic Mancini, an Italian who was in London through these very months and left England in July 1483, setting down what he had gathered in a report completed that December. It is worth knowing what his account is and is not. A private report written for a patron across the sea, drawing on the talk of a frightened and rumor-ridden city rather than on any privileged knowledge. It is precious evidence of the mood and the suspicion of the moment, and it is not, and does not pretend to be, a verdict on what happened. Mancini recorded that after the seizure of the throne, the boys were withdrawn into the inner apartments of the tower and seen more and more rarely, until they ceased to be seen at all. He reported something more particular and more chilling, that the young king's own physician, a man named Argentine, the last of his attendants permitted to remain, described the boy as being in daily fear, seeking confession and penance like a man who believed his death was near. And Mancini recorded that men in the city had already begun to suspect the worst. But he was scrupulous about the limit of his knowledge. He did not write that the princes were dead. He wrote that he had not been able to discover their fate, that the truth of it when he departed could not be known. The second witness is the Crowland Chronicle, the fullest and most reliable of the contemporary English accounts, written by someone close to the government. Of that autumn it says only, with a restraint more devastating than any accusation, that a rumor arose that the sons of King Edward had died a violent death, but that it was uncertain how. That uncertainty is the ghost that has walked through English history for 5 centuries. There was no funeral, there was no lying in state, no display of 2 small bodies to lay the rumor to rest, no proclamation that the boys had died of illness, no mourning ordered, no explanation of any kind. For a new and insecure regime, that silence is the single hardest fact to explain. Consider what even a lie would have bought him. A quiet announcement that the boys had sickened and died, commonplace enough in that century and easy to believe, would have cost Richard little and might have settled the matter. And the regime that could manufacture a marriage pre-contract to take their crown was plainly not incapable of manufacturing an illness to bury them. Yet no such account was ever offered. It is as though the one thing the government could not risk was the attention that any public death of the princes would draw. The questions, the viewing, the funeral, no one could safely stage. If the princes were alive, Richard had every reason on earth to produce them. One glimpse of 2 living boys would have strangled the rumor in its cradle. He never did. The likeliest reason a man does not show that he still holds what he is accused of destroying is that he no longer holds it. When we turn from the silence to the suspects, we enter a labyrinth, and we must go through it fairly. The case against Richard is the strongest, and it is strong for reasons that have nothing to do with Tudor propaganda. He held the boys. The tower was his. No one reached them, fed them, or guarded them but by his authority. He had the clearest motive of any living person, because while those 2 boys breathed, his own title rested on a church court technicality that any turn of politics might overturn, and every discontented man in England had, in them, a lawful king to rally to. And the suspicion fell on him at the time from observers who had no Tudor axe to grind. Mancini, the Crowland writer, and the talk of the continental courts all placed the shadow over Richard while he was still alive and reigning. Motive, means, opportunity, and contemporary suspicion converge on the same man, and yet motive is not proof, and a fair reckoning has to set the alternatives beside him. There is the Duke of Buckingham, Richard's chief partner in the coup, a man with his own royal blood and his own ambitions, who had access to the tower and who by the autumn was in open revolt. It is not impossible that he acted whether for Richard or against him or for himself, but this remains a theory in search of evidence rather than a case. There is the later suggestion that the boys outlived Richard and were destroyed under Henry VII, who had his own powerful reasons to want Edward IV's sons gone. But that theory strains hard against the calendar. The rumor of their deaths was already abroad in the autumn of 1483, 2 full years before Henry Tudor landed in England. To make Henry the killer, one has to explain away the very sources that report the boys were already thought dead while Richard still reigned. And there is the possibility that haunts the whole affair, that one or both of them did not die at all. In the years after Bosworth, pretenders troubled the Tudor throne, and their power lay precisely in the fact that no one could produce the bodies to refute them. The most dangerous of them, a young man history calls Perkin Warbeck, claimed for years to be Richard of Shrewsbury himself, the younger prince, grown to manhood and come back for his inheritance, and kings and courts across Europe entertained him. An earlier pretender, Lambert Simnel, had impersonated a different York prince, a cousin, and not one of the boys at all. But the readiness of Europe to believe in a surviving Plantagenet shows how open the question remained. None of them proved anything. They kept the wound open without healing it. As for physical remains, in 1674, workmen demolishing a stair beside the White Tower found the bones of 2 children, which were taken to be the princes. Charles II ordered them placed in an urn in Westminster Abbey, where they still rest. They were examined once in 1933 and have been argued over ever since, and they have never been securely identified, not as to who the children were, nor even for certain as to the century in which they died. Like the story itself, they answer nothing and refuse to be dismissed. So we come to the verdict, and the honest one refuses to be tidy. The likeliest single explanation of everything we can see, the boys withdrawn and then gone, the total silence, the contemporary suspicion, the regime's failure ever to produce them, is that they died in 1483 in the Tower. And as the man in whose custody they were, and in whose interest their deaths so plainly ran, Richard bears the heaviest responsibility for their fate, whether or not the order came from his own mouth. To hold them was to owe them their safety. When they vanished, the debt fell on him, and no reform, no piety, no northern devotion could ever discharge it. But responsibility is not the same thing as proof, and here the film keeps its discipline. There is no confession. There is no body certainly named. There is no record of a trial or an order or an eyewitness to the deed. There is the silence of the Tower and the weight of inference, and those are heavy, but they are not a smoking gun. Anyone who tells you the case is closed, who names the day and the killer with a novelist's confidence, or who waves the whole thing away and hands Richard back his innocence entire is selling you something, a villain or a martyr, finished to order. The truth is more uncomfortable than either, and we are obliged to sit in that discomfort. 2 children went into the Tower and did not come out. A man who gained by it held the keys and never accounted for it, and the case points toward him without closing, which is exactly where the evidence leaves it and exactly where an honest telling must leave it too. What is not in doubt is what the disappearance did. It changed Richard's reign from a hard beginning into a slow ruin. As the summer turned and the boys did not reappear, the rumor hardened toward belief, and the men who had helped Richard to power because they feared the Woodvilles began to look at their king with a colder eye and to wonder what exactly they had helped to make. The loyalty he had preached his whole life had bound them to him in June. By autumn it was loosening in their hands. And far off, others were watching the same silence and reading in it an opportunity. The princes were gone from the windows of the Tower, but the empty place where they had been did not stay empty. It became the axis on which everything now turned. The vacancy that told Richard's enemies the sons of York were beyond recovery, and that the future would have to be built around someone else. The boys had vanished from history. The consequences of their vanishing were only beginning, and they would, in the end, help to pull the crown from the head of the man who had gained it. If there was a design in the reign of Richard III, it was this: he would rule as though he were the most rightful king England had ever had. Through the autumn of 1483 and into 1484 he moved not like a man who had snatched a throne in a single violent season, but like a sovereign of long and quiet legitimacy, holding court, hearing petitions, granting favor, and setting his hand to the slow work of making a state that functioned for the people who lived under it. This is the hardest dissonance in his whole story. The man who had come to the crown across the disappearance of 2 children, the man whose every act was shadowed by rumor, governed on the evidence of his own laws, as one of the more genuinely reform-minded kings of the medieval age. In January 1484, he summoned the only parliament of his reign. It was a gathering of the realm's great men, many of whom had stood by while he took power, some already beginning to wonder how long the uneasy peace could last. Before them, Richard stood not as a usurper defending a theft, but as a legislator, and the statutes that came out of that session bear the stamp of a man who understood English law as well as any king who had ever worn the crown. That Parliament confirmed his title in the act called Titulus Regius Aes, but it also did real and lasting good. It reformed the law of bail so that a man merely suspected of felony could no longer be flung into prison and stripped of his goods before he was ever convicted. It set property qualifications for jurors to make the juries of England harder to pack and to bribe. It struck at the corruption of royal officers in the shires. It protected the innocent purchasers of land against secret and fraudulent claims. And, most striking of all, it abolished the benevolence, the forced gift that Edward IV had extorted from his subjects under the polite fiction of goodwill, declaring the whole device unlawful. Richard also ordered that the statutes and pleadings of the realm, so long locked in the Latin and law French of a narrow governing class, be set down and published in English, the language of the governed. He founded the College of Arms, granting the heralds of England a charter and a house of their own, bringing order and record to the tangled business of noble lineage. A small, careful, civilizing act that sits strangely beside the violence of his rise. He gave the North a standing council to govern it in his name, the institution that would long outlast him as the Council of the North, and set it under his young nephew, the Earl of Lincoln. He traveled his kingdom with a restless energy, dispensing justice in person and letting ordinary men bring their grievances directly before the king. His piety, whatever else drove it, took solid and costly form. He endowed religious houses and colleges, enlarged the foundations his brother had begun, and planned on a scale that suggests conviction more than display. Chief among his schemes a great chantry at York Minster to be served by a college of 100 priests. His own small book of private prayers survives, worn with handling, a devotion and the date of his birth added in his own hand. And the decree that the law be published in English fell in a moment heavier with meaning than Richard can have known. William Caxton had lately set his printing press at Westminster, and the written word was beginning to reach past the clerks and the courts into the hands of ordinary men. Richard was the first king of England to give his subjects their laws in their own tongue, at the very hour it was becoming possible for those subjects, in growing numbers, to read them for themselves. And in the North, the country that had made him, his popularity was neither invented nor bought. To the men of York and the northern shires, he was not the dark figure of southern rumor. He was the lord who had lived among them for a decade, guarded their border against the Scots, and given them even-handed justice. He had lightened the city of York's heavy burden of royal taxes, confirmed the liberties of northern towns, and answered their petitions with a readiness that southern kings rarely showed, and they held to him. Their loyalty would follow him to the end, and past it, into the record of their grief. Why he governed as he did cannot be known with certainty, and it is more honest to weigh the possibilities than to pretend one of them is proven. Perhaps it was conviction. The piety and the sense of a king's duty to justice were real in him long before the crown was in reach. Perhaps it was the performative devotion of a usurper trying to buy the favor of an unforgiving God, or the conscience of a man with a great deal to atone for. Perhaps it was the plain calculation of a ruler who knew he was not trusted, and understood that a throne as shakily founded as his could only be steadied by making himself useful, indispensable, to the merchants and lawyers and landowners who kept the country running. Most likely it was all of these at once. A man who had lived his whole life by a single word, loyalty, and had in 11 weeks broken faith with his brother's sons, seems to have turned the whole force of that need toward the crown itself, as though he could be loyal to the office if he could no longer be loyal to the boy. Whatever the mixture of motives, the good was not a fiction invented later to excuse him. It stands on the Parliament roll, in the plain record of the acts themselves, acknowledged even by writers who despised him. Here is the deepest strangeness of Richard's reign, and the film will not smooth it away. The same short, bloody reign that opened in judicial murder and the vanishing of 2 children also produced some of the most protective law an English Parliament had passed in living memory. A usurper under a darkening shadow was, in the measurable substance of his government, trying to be a good king. Both things are true. Neither cancels the other, and a telling that keeps only one of them, the reformer or the child killer, is not the man, but a use to which the man has been put. But for all the good law, for all the parchment and ink, there was a ghost at the center of the table, and no statute could disperse it. The silence from the tower had become a presence in every room. There were no more sightings of the boys, no more entries for their keep in any household roll, and no word from the king to explain it. The rumor that the Crowland writer had set down that autumn that Edward's sons had met a violent end, and no one could say how, was never answered from the throne then or ever, and an unanswered rumor of that kind does not fade. It settles and it hardens. This was the trap in which Richard's own virtues caught him. The better he ruled, the more sharply his subjects were made to ask what he had done to earn the ruling. Every fair verdict and every wise measure was weighed against two absent children, and found, by more and more men, to be no answer to them. Men who had stood by him in the summer, who had felt the necessity of his stroke against the Woodvilles, began to feel the weight of their own part in it. The disaffection did not stay silent for long, and when it spoke, the regime's reply showed how thin its confidence had worn. In 1484, a Wiltshire gentleman named William Collingbourne fixed a couplet to the door of St. Paul's, mocking the men who ruled around the king by their heraldic badges. The cat, the rat, and Lovell our dog rule all England under a hog, Catesby, Ratcliffe, and Viscount Lovell, governing under Richard's own emblem, the white boar. It was a small thing, a piece of doggerel. But Collingbourne was also in secret correspondence with the exiles across the sea, and he was taken, condemned, and put to death with the full and deliberate cruelty the law reserved for traitors. A king secure in the love of his people does not need to disembowel a man for a rhyme. The savagery of the answer measured the depth of the unease beneath it. For beneath the orderly surface of the reign, the ground had begun to move. The old alliance that had carried Richard to the throne, the lords and gentry who had backed him against the Woodvilles in the summer of 1483, was fraying, and it was fraying not over anything he was doing as king, but over what he had done to become one. Many of the men now turning against him were of the south, gentry of Edward IV's own household, servants of the old king, who could not forgive what had become of the old king's sons. If the boys were dead, their king was a murderer. If they were somehow alive, he was their jailer. And either way, the stability he was building rested on sand. Their eyes were moving across the Channel, to Brittany, to the small court of exiles gathered around a man few in England had ever taken seriously, Henry Tudor, in whom the broken Lancastrian claim now found its last unlikely heir. The silence from the Tower had given the opposition the one thing it had always lacked, a reason to believe that the sons of York were beyond recovery and that the future lay elsewhere. So the paradox of Richard's kingship stood complete and unresolved. The reforms were genuine, the justice was real, the loyalty of the North was true and would hold to the last. He had reached the summit of his ambition and proved past any doubt that he could govern, that he was no mere destroyer, but a man with a real vision of a better ordered realm, and none of it could buy him the one thing he could not legislate into being, the trust of a people who had watched two children go into the Tower and never come out. He was trying to rule his way out of his own history, to earn after the fact a crown that had not been given to him but taken. But some debts are not paid in statute or justice or ink, and no king, however diligent, can govern his way out from under a question his subjects will not stop asking. Far across the water, the reckoning for this one was already being prepared, and it would come not as a verdict but as an army. The summer of 1483 had been a season of consolidation, a king laboring by sheer method to turn a coup into a reign. Through July and August, Richard went on progress, moving north and west through his kingdom in a slow procession of judgments and gestures. He dispensed justice in the towns. He refused, pointedly, the gifts of money that grateful cities pressed upon him, so that men might see a king who could not be bought. He endowed churches and received the homage of the country he had taken. At York, beneath the vaults of the minster, he had his only son, Edward of Middleham, invested as Prince of Wales in a ceremony of deliberate northern splendor. To the men who watched him in those weeks, he seemed everything a medieval king was supposed to be: pious, tireless, unsleeping in the business of rule. And beneath the surface, the ground was already moving. The first fracture ran through the man who had stood closest to him. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, was among the greatest nobles in England, a descendant of Edward III with a strain of royal blood of his own, and he had been Richard's indispensable partner in the seizure of the crown. It was Buckingham who had ridden with him to intercept the young king at Stony Stratford. Buckingham who had worked the crowds of London, Buckingham who had spoken for Richard's title when the throne changed hands. For his service he had been rewarded lavishly: offices, lands, a great swathe of authority across Wales and the West. And yet by the autumn the Duke had turned, and the reasons remain among the small mysteries of the reign. Something had soured. Whether it was thwarted ambition, the discontent of a man who had helped make a king and found himself still only a subject, or the promptings of the prisoner in his own keeping, no one can say with certainty. For at Brecon, in Buckingham's custody, sat John Morton, Bishop of Ely, one of the shrewdest and most implacable enemies Richard possessed, a man with every reason to whisper and the wit to do it well. What is certain is that in October Buckingham withdrew to his estates in Wales and raised his standard against the king he had made. In the 15th century, such a withdrawal was never contemplation. It was war. Around the Duke, a strange and desperate coalition was forming, the kind of alliance that only a common enemy could explain. Into it came the scattered remnants of the Woodville affinity, the servants and kinsmen of the Queen whose power Richard had broken in the spring, gentry of the southern shires who had served Edward IV faithfully and could not stomach what had become of his sons, and behind them, reaching across the Channel, the thin Lancastrian remnant that had survived Tewkesbury. The startling thing to those who watched it form was that the core of the rising was not Lancastrian at all. Its first movers were Edward IV's own loyal men, sheriffs, esquires, and servants of the dead king's household, the very people who ought to have been the natural bedrock of any Yorkist throne. That such men would take up arms against a Yorkist king told its own story about what they had come to believe had become of that king's sons. What bound these unlike men together was not love of Buckingham. It was a rumor, and the rumor concerned two children. For the risings that broke out that October dawn in Kent, in the home counties in the West Country, a broad arc of rebellion across the south of England, had not begun as Buckingham's at all. They had begun, it appears, as a movement to rescue the sons of Edward IV from the Tower and set the elder boy back upon his throne. But somewhere in the planning the object changed. And it changed because word had spread through the autumn that the boys were already dead. There was no proclamation, no funeral, no body shown, only an absence that had hardened over the summer into a rumor no one could disprove and the regime would not address. And once men believed the princes gone, the whole shape of the opposition turned upon its axis. For if the boys were dead, the eldest of Edward IV's surviving children was his daughter, Elizabeth of York. And that fact suggested a solution of terrible arithmetic elegance. There was across the sea in Brittany a claimant almost no one had taken seriously, Henry Tudor, the last hope of Lancaster, a young man who had spent half his life in exile under the protection of the Duke of Brittany and whose descent ran through the Beauforts, a line born of John of Gaunt outside marriage, legitimated afterward and barred, at least in principle, from the throne. His claim by blood was thin to the point of transparency. But if he were married to Elizabeth of York, the white rose joined to the red, then the union might accomplish what 30 years of battle had not, close the wound of the civil wars for good, and give an exhausted political nation a settlement it could accept. The plan was audacious, and it was cynical, and it made the vanished princes the hinge of everything. Their absence was no longer a private horror whispered in the Tower. It had become the foundation upon which Richard's enemies proposed to raise a new dynasty. Let that weight rest where it belongs. The opposition to Richard now organized itself around the presumption that his nephews were gone. Henry Tudor was an unlikely nemesis, and to grasp the fear he came to inspire one has to see how little he had begun with. He was the son of Edmund Tudor, a half-brother of the Lancastrian King Henry VI, and of Margaret Beaufort, a formidable heiress who had borne him at the age of 13, some months after her young husband's death. He had been a small child in a losing cause, passed from guardian to guardian through the wars, and when the Lancastrian world was finally destroyed at Tewkesbury in 1471, his uncle Jasper Tudor had carried the boy of 14 out of England altogether to Brittany, where he had lived ever since, a landless exile of no great account, kept by the Duke of Brittany as a card that might one day be worth the playing. For a dozen years he had been precisely that, and nothing more. The events of a single summer made him, almost overnight, the one man in Christendom around whom the enemies of Richard III could gather. He had done nothing to earn the part. The disappearance of two boys had thrust it upon him. Richard did not panic. When the reports reached him, he moved with the cold competence that had carried him this far. He proclaimed Buckingham a traitor, set a price upon his head, summoned his loyal lords, and marched to meet the rising. And then, before a blow had been struck, the weather did his work for him. In the middle of October, the skies over the west of England opened, and the rain that fell was remembered for a generation. The rivers rose, the roads dissolved, the Severn burst its banks and spread into a brown inland sea so vast that men afterward called the flood the Duke of Buckingham's great water. It fell precisely where it would ruin him. Buckingham, marching out of Wales to join his confederates in the south, found the river impassable before him, and his own Welsh tenants, unpaid and unwilling, melting away behind. His army dissolved in the mud without a battle. The southern risings, cut off from their leader and from one another, flared and guttered out in isolation, and far out in the Channel the small fleet carrying Henry Tudor toward England was scattered by the same storms. When at last a few of his ships stood off the southern coast and he saw armed men waiting on the shore, he suspected, rightly, a trap and turned back to Brittany without ever setting foot on English ground. The rebellion collapsed as swiftly as it had risen. Buckingham, abandoned and alone, went into hiding in the house of a servant, and the servant, for fear or for the reward, gave him up. He was taken to Salisbury, where the king had come with his army. There the Duke begged for an audience. Some said to plead for his life, some said to come near enough to strike Richard down with a hidden blade. Richard refused to see him. On the 2nd of November, 1483, in the marketplace at Salisbury, Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, the man who had done more than any other to set Richard on the throne, was beheaded without trial. By the middle of the month, the last embers of the rising were cold. Richard had won, and the victory was total, and it changed nothing that mattered. He had put down the rebellion, scattered his enemies, and demonstrated beyond argument that he could hold his crown by force. But the rising had shown him the shape of the thing gathering against him, and it was not a thing that force could dissolve. On Christmas Day in the cathedral at Rennes, the exiles gathered around Henry Tudor, and Henry swore a public oath before them that he would take Elizabeth of York to wife and make himself King of England. The men who knelt to him then were not, most of them, Lancastrians by conviction. They were Englishmen of Edward IV's own party who had concluded that the House of York, under Richard, was no longer a house they could serve. That was the measure of what the summer had cost him. He had cleared the board, and the vacancy remained. The princes in the Tower were now a silence at the center of his reign, and the silence had become an argument, the most powerful his enemies possessed, precisely because he could not answer it. To have produced the boys alive would have ended every conspiracy in a single morning, and he did not produce them. Whatever the truth of their fate, that failure hung over everything he did afterward, in the council chamber and on the road, an absence that spoke more plainly than any accusation could. And so Richard entered the winter of 1483, the undisputed master of England and the most isolated man in it. He had defended a throne that few now believed was rightfully his, against a claimant who a year before had been a footnote, and in the defending he had watched the best men of his brother's affinity choose exile over his service. The rebellion had failed, but it had defined the terms of the reckoning to come and named the man who would bring it. Across the sea, in a foreign prince's court, Henry Tudor was waiting, and Richard, for all his victories, had bought himself time and not a future. Worse was coming, and it would not come from his enemies. It would come from within his own house in the space of a single year, and it would take from him the two people for whom the crown had been worth the holding at all. The year 1484 opened for the King of England with the appearance of security and the substance of dread. The rebellion was crushed, its leaders dead or fled. The North that had raised him remained, as it had always been, the bedrock of his power. He had summoned his one and only Parliament, and it was passing good laws in his name. He had a crown, a council, and a careful, competent administration, and at the center of all of it, the thing that gave the rest its meaning, he had a son. Edward of Middleham was the whole future of Richard's line, the child in whom a seized crown became a dynasty rather than an episode. He was a delicate boy. The records suggest he had never been strong, and he had passed his short life largely in the clear air of Wensleydale at Middleham, the castle where his father had been raised to lordship and had known for a decade the nearest thing to contentment his life afforded. Richard had been shaped above all by his own devotion to his brother. Now that same capacity for attachment had fixed itself upon his son, the boy who was to carry the House of York out of the shadow of its founding and into a settled reign. Even the chroniclers who would later sharpen their pens against his memory did not doubt that he loved the child. Then, in April of 1484, almost to the day a year after Edward IV had died and set the whole catastrophe in motion, the child died too. It was not a war that broke the king, it was a fever, a thing against which no army and no crown was of the slightest use. The records are spare, as they always are for the deaths of children, but the grief they record is not. Richard and Anne were at Nottingham Castle when the news came to them from Middleham, and the chroniclers wrote that the king and queen, hearing it, fell almost out of their minds with grief, a phrase all the more striking for coming from men who owed him nothing. In the span of a few weeks, the entire purpose of the reign was gone. The coup, the executions, the crown itself had been justified in Richard's own reckoning and in the logic of his age by the continuation of his house. Now the house had no future into which to continue. It was said afterward that he never cared for Nottingham again and called it his castle of care. The death did more than break a father. It unmade the political calculation upon which everything else had rested. A king with an heir is a settlement. A king without one is an interval, a life tenancy that the ambitious need only outlast. The great men who had bent the knee began quietly to reckon the odds afresh, and the only alternative on offer was the young man across the water, whose distant claim now drew to itself every calculation that a childless Richard could no longer answer. There was, in strict law, an heir to be found, but the finding of one only underlined how far the House of York had already consumed itself. Richard's brother George of Clarence had left a son, the young Earl of Warwick, but the boy was barred from the succession by his father's attainder for treason, and there was, besides, something in Richard that would not raise a child to be his heir in the very shadow of the summer he had just survived. And so the likeliest heir became another nephew, John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, a capable grown man, the son of one of his sisters, whom Richard now advanced and drew close about him. It was a sensible enough resort, and it deceived no one. An heir presumptive drawn sideways out of the family, named because there was no son to name, was not a dynasty. It was a stopgap, and every lord in England could recognize a stopgap when he saw one, and the ruin was not finished. Anne Neville, the girl he had known at Middleham 30 years before, the wife who had shared the strange summer of his crowning, had never been robust, and the loss of her only child seemed to draw off whatever strength remained to her. Through the winter she failed, wasted by the slow, consuming illness that the 15th century could neither name precisely nor arrest, almost certainly the tuberculosis that killed so quietly and so completely. As she declined, the court drew back from her. Her physicians, it was said, counseled the king to keep from her bed. On the 16th of March, 1485, Anne Neville died. And on that same day, as though the heavens meant to be understood, the sun was darkened by an eclipse. In an age that read the sky as a ledger of divine intent, no one failed to mark it, a queen dead, and the light failing on a single day. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, near the shrine of the Confessor, and for centuries no stone marked the place. It was in the space that Anne's death opened that the ugliest rumor of Richard's life took hold. It was put about him, and it spread with the speed of a thing people wished to believe, that the king had poisoned his own wife, that he had cleared her from his path in order to marry a younger and more useful woman, and the woman named was the one whose very existence made the slander plausible, Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter, Richard's own niece. The logic was as cold as the accusation was monstrous. Henry Tudor had built his entire enterprise upon the promise to marry Elizabeth. She was the living link that raised his cause above a Lancastrian daydream. If Richard married her first, he would strike that weapon clean out of his rival's hand. To his enemies, the arithmetic was proof of appetite. A king who had already, they murmured, disposed of his brother's sons, now poisoning his wife and reaching for his niece. A man who would commit incest and murder alike to keep his grip upon a crown. The truth beneath the rumor was narrower and sadder. That the marriage was discussed, at least as a possibility, seems clear enough. The danger it posed to Henry Tudor was real, and Richard's own counselors treated it as real. That he poisoned Anne is Tudor slander, unproven then and unprovable now, and contradicted by the plain fact of a woman who had been visibly and lengthily ill. But rumor does not wait upon proof, and this one was doing him grievous harm in his own capital. So dangerous had it grown that Richard's closest advisers, Sir Richard Ratcliffe and William Catesby, the men nearest his person, pressed him to answer it in the open. They warned him, it was reported, that the North would never forgive him if he married the girl, for it would seem he had put aside a daughter of the Nevilles to do it, and that many already half believed he had made away with her. And so, at the end of March, 1485, in the great hall of the Hospital of St. John at Clerkenwell, before the mayor and the citizens of London, the King of England was reduced to standing up and denying in a loud and clear voice that he had ever wished to marry his brother's daughter. It is one of the strangest scenes of the reign. An anointed king who had commanded armies and governed the north for a decade, publicly disavowing an intention he may never have formed. In order to quiet a story he could find no other way to stop. He silenced the talk. He could not undo it. Elizabeth of York was sent away from the court north to the safety of Sheriff Hutton, and the image of Richard that the rumor had drawn, the man who would stop at nothing, not even the ruin of his own family, sank into the public mind and settled there. He was by the spring of 1485 a king with no heir, no queen, and a dwindling circle of men he could trust. The motto he had carried all his life had become something close to a reproach. Loyaulté may lie, loyalty binds me. He had been loyal to his brother, and his brother's sons were gone into silence. He had been loyal to the north, and the north still held, but the rest of the realm was drifting from him week upon week. He had been loyal in his fashion to his wife, and she lay now in the ground at Westminster. Loyalty had bound him, and it had left him very nearly alone. The circle he leaned on had narrowed to a handful, northern men and household servants who had risen with him and would stand or fall with him. Francis Lovell, the friend of his boyhood at Middleham, Sir Richard Ratcliffe, William Catesby. So conspicuous had his dependence upon these few become that a disaffected gentleman named William Collingbourne pinned a rhyme to the door of St. Paul's to mock it. The cat, the rat, and Lovell our dog rule all England under a hog, the hog being the white boar that Richard wore as his own badge. It was a small and sneering couplet, and the severity of the regime's answer to it measured the tightness of the times, for Collingbourne was put to death with exceptional cruelty. A king secure in the love of his people does not hang men for rhymes. Across the Channel the reports hardened from rumor into fact. Henry Tudor was no longer merely the figurehead of exile's toasts. He was gathering ships and men, drawing to himself the disaffected, the turncoats, and the desperate, and the French crown, for reasons of its own, was willing to pay for the enterprise. Anyone who could read the season knew that, when the winds turned favorable in the summer, he would come. Richard prepared to meet him. He was not a man who wanted for courage, and he did not want for it now. He had spent his life in the saddle and understood, better than most, how the coming war would have to be fought. He moved to Nottingham, the castle at the very center of his kingdom, to wait where he might march quickest in any direction the blow should fall. But there was a shadow over the preparations that no muster could lift. He was assembling an army to defend a crown that had cost him, in 2 years, his nephew's place in the world, his son, his wife, and the trust of half his kingdom, a throne that had begun to resemble a tomb. He turned to face the summer knowing that what remained to be settled was no longer the future of a dynasty, for the dynasty was already gone. What remained was only the manner of the ending and the question of who would be left standing afterward to write it down. By the summer of 1485 the kingdom was waiting, and so was the king. For 2 years Richard had governed a country that had never quite consented to him, and the effort showed. He had buried his son and then his wife within a single year. The succession was hollow, and he ruled now by vigilance and force, a man who, the chroniclers said, slept badly, watching always the horizon and the sea beyond it for the one enemy every grievance in England had gathered behind. His name was Henry Tudor, and in August he came. The landing, when it came, was not the great invasion Richard had braced for. On the 7th of August 1485, Henry Tudor put ashore at Mill Bay near Milford Haven on the western tip of Wales with a small army, a few thousand men, most of them French mercenaries loaned by the French crown, stiffened by the English exiles who had followed him into poverty and now followed him home. He came ashore, knelt and kissed the ground, and began to march north and east through Wales, gathering strength as he went. Welsh lords who had waited to see a standard raised now rode to it. Rhys ap Thomas, the great power of the south, brought his men over to the invader. What had landed as a raid began to swell into an army. Richard, at Nottingham, heard of the landing and did not at first appear alarmed. He had beaten a rebellion before. He summoned the lords of the realm to bring their men to him and destroy this one as he had destroyed the last. But the response, when it came, was the coldest news of the reign. The summons went out, and the great muster he expected did not assemble. Some lords came, many delayed, some sent excuses, and some sent nothing at all. The feudal machine that was supposed to bring England's fighting men to their anointed king turned over and did not catch. The heart of the nobility was waiting, as it had waited at every crisis of these wars, to see which way the day would go before it spent a single life upon it. The two armies came together in the flat country of Leicestershire near the town of Market Bosworth on the morning of the 22nd of August. Richard had the larger force by far, perhaps twice Henry's numbers, and the ground and the guns and the authority of the anointed crown, which he wore that day upon his helmet, so that no man on either field could mistake where the king was. By the older reckoning, he should have won before noon. But numbers on a battlefield are only as good as the will of the men who hold them, and Richard's army that morning was made of three parts that did not trust one another. In the vanguard stood the one great lord whose loyalty was beyond question, John Howard, Duke of Norfolk, an old soldier of the House of York who had risen with Richard and would fall with him. Behind, commanding the rearguard, stood Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, with a large body of northern men, and Northumberland, for reasons he never afterward had to explain, would stand where he was through the whole of the battle and never bring them into it. And off to the side, upon rising ground, sat the largest question on the field, the brothers Stanley. Thomas, Lord Stanley, and Sir William Stanley held several thousand men between them, and they had come to Bosworth committed to neither side. Lord Stanley was married to Margaret Beaufort, which is to say that he was Henry Tudor's own stepfather, and Richard, who knew exactly how far that made the man to be trusted, had taken the precaution of holding Stanley's son and heir, Lord Strange, as a hostage against his good behavior. As the armies formed, Richard sent word to Stanley to bring his men into the royal line. Stanley returned the answer of a man keeping his options open. He would come in his own time. Richard, in fury, ordered Lord Strange put to death. In the press of the morning, the order was not carried out, and the hostage's life and the father's treason hung unresolved as the first guns fired. The Crowland chronicler, who was close to the court, wrote that Richard had passed a dreadful night before the battle, troubled by terrible dreams, and had come out in the morning with a face like ash. Whether that is the truth of the man, or the omen-hunting of a writer setting it down after the fact, no one can now say. What is not in doubt is what he did when the fighting turned against him. The battle opened with the guns and the arrows, and then the vanguards met, Norfolk's men grinding forward into Henry's line under its French captains. It did not break. Norfolk himself was killed in the fighting at the front, the truest of Richard's lords dead in the first hour, and with him went the momentum of the royal army. Richard looked to his rearguard and saw Northumberland's thousands standing motionless. He looked to the Stanleys and saw them still holding off. He was a king with the larger army watching it refuse to fight. And then, across the field, he saw something else. Henry Tudor himself, with only his household about him, riding out beyond the shelter of his own lines, perhaps to reach the Stanleys and beg them in at the last. For a moment the man who was the cause of everything stood exposed on the open ground, and Richard made the decision that his enemies, for all they blackened everything else about him, could never quite manage to make small. He could have waited, he could have held the higher ground and fought the cautious battle, or, when it soured, taken the fast horse that, it was later reported, his friends pressed upon him and ridden clear to fight another year. He refused it. He would not, he was said to have declared, live 1 hour except as King of England. He gathered the knights of his household about him, closed his visor, and led them straight down the field at Henry Tudor. It was a charge of single and terrible purpose, and for a few minutes it very nearly succeeded. Richard and his household knights drove clean across the open ground and into the knot of men about the Pretender, and the king fought at their head with his own hand. He struck down Sir John Cheney, a soldier famous for his great size, and hurled him from the saddle. He reached Henry's standard-bearer, William Brandon, and killed him, and the red dragon banner of Cadwallader went down into the mud. He was within a lance's length of Henry Tudor himself, close enough, men said, to see the Pretender's face, with the whole of his lost future one sword stroke away. It was the moment the Stanleys had been waiting for. Seeing the king committed, isolated, and all but through to their stepson, Sir William Stanley threw his fresh thousands into the battle at last, not to the rescue of the king who had spared his brother's son that very morning, but against him. The Stanley horse crashed into the flank of Richard's little band and swallowed it. Richard's own horse floundered and stuck fast in the marshy ground at the foot of the field, and the king was thrown down among his enemies. He would not yield. On foot, unhorsed, ringed by men who had been his subjects at dawn, Richard Plantagenet fought until he was cut down, and the word the chroniclers set in his mouth at the end, the last word of the last king of England ever to die in battle, was treason. He was killed in the end by the very thing he had made the whole of his life. Loyaulté me lie, loyalty binds me, had never been a pose for Richard. It was the one fixed point of a violent existence, the vow he had kept to his brother without a single lapse across 30 years while everyone around him turned and turned again. And he was destroyed, on Ambien Field, by its exact opposite, by the calculated treachery of men who owed him their allegiance and sold it to the winning side while the battle hung. That the man later remembered as the arch-betrayer of English history should himself die betrayed, crying treason with his last breath, is the deepest irony of a life that was full of them, and it is not the Tudors' invention. Even the men who hated him recorded it. Even Polydore Virgil, writing to please the dynasty that had killed him, allowed that Richard died fighting manfully in the thickest press of his enemies. He had done the one thing that, whatever else he had done, no one has ever been able to take from him. Faced with defeat, he refused to run. The victors were not moved to reverence. The crown he had worn into battle was found, tradition says, in the confusion of the field, caught in a hawthorn bush, and it was Lord Stanley, the man whose treachery had decided the day, who set it upon Henry Tudor's head and made him on the spot King Henry VII. Richard's body was stripped naked, slung across the back of a horse with a felon's contempt, and carried into Leicester, where it was put on public show for 2 days so that the whole country might know the last Plantagenet was dead. Then it was buried without pomp and almost without ceremony in the Church of the Greyfriars in Leicester, a quiet grave in a provincial friary for a man who had been King of England, and it would keep its secret for 500 years. But the record did not belong entirely to the winners, not yet. Away in the north, in the city that had loved him, the news came the very next day, and the men of York did not receive it as their new king would have wished. In their council book, in the plain hand of a city clerk, they set down what they believed had happened, and it stands as the truest epitaph the man ever got, that King Richard, late mercifully reigning upon us, had been pitilessly slain and murdered to the great heaviness of this city. It was a dangerous thing to write of a man the new regime meant to bury in infamy, and they wrote it anyway. Whatever the rest of England believed, the North that had known him best grieved him as a good lord, murdered. The battle was over, and the dynasty of Tudor had begun. But the longest fight of Richard's life was not the one he lost that morning in the Leicestershire mud. It was the one that started the moment he fell, the slow, patient, 500-year war over what he had been, fought not with steel but in ink by the men who had won the field and needed now to win the story. The battle at Bosworth ended Richard's life. It did not end his story, because the men who had killed him could not afford to let it end. A dynasty founded on an invader's sword and a claim that would not bear close inspection needed a justification, and the readiest justification lay in the character of the man it had replaced. If Richard could be shown to have been a monster, then the killing of him became a rescue, and the usurper who followed him became a deliverer. And so the last and longest campaign against Richard III began the moment the fighting stopped, and it was waged not with steel, but with ink. The work was not done in a day. It was laid down in courses over more than a century, each hand building upon the one before. It began with the official histories of the new regime. Henry VII commissioned an Italian humanist, Polydore Virgil, to write the history of England, and Virgil, a careful scholar, but one who knew whose bread he ate, set the frame. Richard the dissembler, the murderer of his nephews, the tyrant whose fall was the manifest will of God. Upon that frame, a generation later, Sir Thomas More built the architecture of the nightmare. More was a boy of 7 when Richard died. He never saw the man, and his history of King Richard III, written around 1513 and never finished, is a work of literature and moral argument, not testimony. It has the shape of a tragedy because More meant it to have one, a study of how tyranny is born and how it corrupts a soul. It is also, very probably, colored by the memories of the household in which More had been raised as a boy, that of John Morton, Bishop of Ely, the same Morton who had sat in Buckingham's custody, helping to plot Richard's fall, and who had no reason on earth to remember him kindly. It was More who gave the legend its most theatrical scene. The council meeting at which Richard, so the story goes, bared a withered, shrunken arm and accused his enemies of having blasted it by witchcraft, a piece of pure stagecraft invented to show a tyrant manufacturing a pretext for murder before men's eyes. And it was the Tudor writers, more broadly, The antiquary John Roos foremost among them, a man who had praised Richard fulsomely while he lived and reversed himself entirely once he was safely dead, who supplied the grotesque nursery details that Richard had lain 2 years in his mother's womb and come forth with teeth already in his head and hair down to his shoulders, a creature marked as monstrous from his first breath. None of it was observation. All of it was the literature of a regime teaching its subjects how to remember the man it had destroyed. And then came the stage, and the stage finished what the histories had begun. Near the end of the 16th century, William Shakespeare took the Tudor chronicles and made from them the most magnificent villain in the English language, a Richard of such wit, such gleeful and confiding malice, such terrible charm that he simply devoured the real man and stood forever after in his place. This was the Richard who steps forward to tell the audience that now is the winter of their discontent. The Richard who, in the wreck of Bosworth, screams for a horse and offers his kingdom for one. They are among the most famous lines ever written for the English theatre, and they are Shakespeare's, not Richard's, words set in a dead king's mouth by a dramatist working a century after the fact, for a company that lived and performed under the granddaughter of the man who had beaten him. Shakespeare gave his Richard the hump, the limp, the withered arm, and the joy in evil. He called him a bottled spider and a poisonous hunchbacked toad, and he did it so well that for 400 years the portrait simply was the man. It is the cruelest turn in the whole story, that England's greatest playwright should have set the seal upon the propaganda of a dynasty, and that the villain should be so compelling that no mere fact has ever quite dislodged him. For 5 centuries that shadow lay across the record, but the pendulum in time swung and swung in its turn too far. From the 18th century onward, a countercurrent set in. Horace Walpole published his historic doubts, questioning the whole Tudor case. In the 20th century, a society formed expressly to defend Richard's memory, and a novelist, Josephine Tay, in The Daughter of Time, put the case for the defense to a mass readership so persuasively that a great many readers closed the book convinced the man had been innocent of everything laid against him. The Ricardian cause did real and lasting service. It recovered the good lord of the north, the reformer, the able and pious administrator whom the Tudor legend had painted out of the picture entirely. But it carried its own temptation, and many who took it up could not resist it, the temptation to answer one caricature with another, to scrub the man so clean that the summer of 1483 simply disappeared, and to make of Richard a spotless, wronged, chivalric martyr who could not conceivably have harmed a child. That Richard is no more real than Shakespeare's. Both are monoliths, and the man was not a monolith. Then, in the autumn of 2012, the long argument met the earth. Beneath a car park in the middle of Leicester, on ground where the choir of the long-demolished Greyfriars Church had once stood, archaeologists uncovered a grave and in it the skeleton of a man. The bones were tested and dated and matched through the female line to living descendants of Richard's own family, and the identification was made as certain as such things can be made. This was the king lost at Bosworth. And the bones, silent for 5 centuries, settled several arguments in a single stroke. They put an end to the monster. There was no hunchback, there was no withered arm, there was no shortened, dragging leg. There was instead the spine of a man who had developed in adolescence a pronounced sideways curvature, a scoliosis that would have carried one shoulder, the right, higher than the other, and taken a little from his height, but that a good tailor could dress and a strong young man could learn to master. This was not a cripple. This was an active soldier who had ridden and trained and fought at the front of battles, carrying a hidden pain and looking to the world very nearly like other men. The deformity the Tudors had made into the emblem of his crooked soul was, in the flesh, a curved back, real but nothing whatever like the thing the legend had needed it to be. To read the curve of that spine as the shape of the man's wickedness is the oldest of the Tudor moves, and it is the one we set down here for good. And the same bones told the other half of the truth just as plainly. The skull and skeleton bore the marks of a hard death and a worse aftermath, a cluster of wounds about the head, 2 of them at the base of the skull savage enough to have killed him, of the kind a man takes when his helmet is gone and he is fighting on foot and surrounded, and other injuries, smaller and meaner, dealt to the body after death, the humiliation wounds of men avenging themselves upon a corpse. It matched in every particular what the chroniclers had written of a king cut down in the press and then abused. In the spring of 2015, the remains were carried through the streets and buried again, with the honor that had been denied them, beneath the floor of Leicester Cathedral, a few hundred yards from the forgotten friary where his enemies had first put him out of sight. The grave answered a great deal. It did not answer the one question that matters most. The bones under the car park were Richard's. They were not his nephew's. The skeleton settled the shape of the man's back and the manner of his death, but it said nothing at all of two boys who were last glimpsed at the windows of the tower in the summer of 1483 and then never seen again. That silence remains exactly as loud and exactly as unresolved as it has always been. The likeliest single explanation is still the plainest one, that the princess died that summer in the tower in the keeping and the interest of the man who had taken their crown, and that Richard bears the heaviest weight of responsibility for their fate, whether the order was his own or another's given in his name. But it is inference, not proof. No body was ever certainly theirs, no confession was ever made, and anyone who tells you the case is closed, in either direction, is selling you something. And so we are left with neither of the two figures the centuries have pressed upon us. Not the demon of the Tudor stage, the crookback who murdered for the pleasure of it. That man never existed. And not the flawless martyr of his later defenders, the good knight wronged by history. That man never existed either. What is left when both are set aside is harder to hold and truer than either. A capable, pious, and ferociously loyal man formed by a savage war and adored in the north he governed well, who in the space of 11 weeks in the summer of 1483 executed men without trial, took his young nephew's crown, and presided over the disappearance of two children who were never seen alive again, and who thereby put two boys beyond the reach of history and his own name beyond the reach of rescue. He was not the monster the winners drew. He was something they could not draw because it was worse for being real. He was a man, the city of York, which had known him longest, called him mercifully reigning, and grieved him, piteously slain. The dynasty that killed him called him a beast, and made the name hold for 500 years. He was neither, and he was, in his contradictions, both at once. His life had opened with a paper crown, the mocking, worthless thing his enemies had jammed upon his dead father's head above the gates of York when he was a boy of 8, and it had closed with a real one, struck from his own helmet and lost in a Leicestershire marsh, plucked from a thorn bush and set on the head of the man who had destroyed him. Between those two crowns ran the whole of Richard Plantagenet, loyalty and betrayal, good governance and unforgivable crime, a life that no legend has ever managed to tell straight, because the truth of it will not resolve into a legend at all.